Want to be happy? Build a life, not just a business. Hey, it's Evan Carmichael, and this channel is created to help you overcome the number one challenge that is holding you back, a lack of belief in yourself. You watch these videos because you know there's something more inside you too. You've got Michael Jordan level genius at something. So today, let's live your best belief life and get some incredible motivation from the one and only Andrew Huberman.
For any of us, success in any endeavor is very closely related to how much focus we can bring to that endeavor. And the reward system, you start to realize, is entirely internal. No one's coming along and cramming dopamine in your ear or dripping it in your brain. It's all internal. And this starts to bring us into the kind of like discussion around mindsets. Because so my colleague Carol Dweck, who popularized this theme, growth mindset, it's, again, a very misunderstood concept. It's the idea that we can change, so that's built into that. But the discovery of growth mindset was of these kids that actually really enjoyed doing problem sets that they knew they couldn't get right. But for them, they would get this like dopamine release from just focusing on the problem. They liked doing puzzles they couldn't get right. It sounds crazy, but inevitably those kids are very good at puzzles and very good at math and these kinds of things. So growth mindset is, I believe, if a sort of a neuroscience lens on growth mindset would be that the agitation and stress that you feel at the beginning of something and when you're trying to lean into it and you can't focus is just a recognized gate. You have to pass through that gate to get to the focus component. And then if you can reward the effort process, you really start to feel joy and low levels of excitement in the effort process. That's that buffering of adrenaline. That's that feeling like, yes, I've got a lot of adrenaline in my system, but I'm on the right path. It feels good to walk up this hill, so to speak. And when you start to bring those neural circuits together, you really start to create a whole set of circuits that are designed to be exported to any behavior you want. So if it's writing a book, great. If it's podcasting, great. If it's building a business, great. If it's building a terrific relationship, great. Then the circuits that Mother Nature has designed are incredibly generic so that we could adapt to whatever it is that we need to do. And I think the misunderstanding around how these circuits work has led to this idea that there's some secret entry point, maybe marked flow on the door, and there's a trampoline up to that door, and you just open that door and you're gonna be in it.
Right.
And nothing could be further from the truth. And anyone who's done well in any career or athletic pursuit knows this, but unfortunately, there's a kind of obsession with the idea that it's all supposed to feel good. And it does feel good, but there's a whole staircase in which it feels kind of lousy. We can be driven from a place of anger, frustration, and revenge, or we can be driven from a place of, love, gratitude, and et cetera. I'm not here to judge which one is better or worse, but the nervous system doesn't distinguish between them. So if you're the kind of person that needs to, kind of budge yourself into something, great. If you're the kind of person that wants to do things from more of a warm, fuzzy feeling, that's fine too. What I will say is this. The ability to tap into this dopamine reward system, which is activated anytime you're in pursuit of something that's outside the boundaries of your skin and literally the boundaries of your body, as well as the reward system, the serotonin oxytocin system, which is really about the things that are contained within your own body and immediate experience, things like gratitude and, touch and comfort and things like that with loved ones. The ability to tap into both is crucial. Now, you said something really important, which was, negative thoughts. What to do? I don't believe that it's very easy to suppress negative thoughts. However, when you realize that thoughts can be deliberately introduced, you can start replacing negative thoughts with new types of thoughts. So you can always add something in. But when people start to realize that thoughts are very much like physical actions of reaching and picking up a glass of water, or taking a jog around the block, or typing an email perfectly. This is something I sometimes do because I struggle to do the perfect email. Not all my emails are perfect, but when I do one, I make sure that I complete it and I think, okay, it's possible. It's not because the email being perfect is so important. It's because I want to remind myself that my thoughts and my actions are essentially the same. The nervous system can organize thoughts. So for somebody that's struggling, we have these examples like, oh, they were really back on their heels, or they were so depleted, no money, and all this stuff. What are they going to? We have so many examples like that. But in trying to make it actionable, it's really about saying, yep, that's all true. But I'm going to introduce a thought, which is, I made it through today. I made it through today, and that's actually worth celebrating at a micro level. So if you can give yourself dopamine rewards in small increments, right? You're not trying to celebrate that you made it through one day. Sometimes that's a huge feat, but most of the time, you just want to dose yourself with a little bit of that internal release of dopamine. You start rewarding incremental steps. And if there's anything that your listeners could take away from this whole thing about dopamine and reward schedules and being in movement, it's reward incremental steps, in particular, incremental steps that are about forward action. So maybe that's writing an email. Maybe that's that run around the block. Maybe that's something much grander for you. As you get better at things, right, the stairs get further and further away from one another because you've achieved more success. And so they tend to be, you have to take the rungs on the ladder further apart, so to speak. That's a time when you really need to implement not only the dopamine rewards, but also those serotonin and oxytocin rewards, et cetera. So to make it actionable, I would say, remember, don't spend so much time trying to suppress negative thoughts. If you need trauma therapy, pursue that with a professional. But if you have negative thoughts, just remember, I can also introduce positive thoughts. The same way I can control running around the block. Positive thoughts are the equivalent of forward physical action. And if you reward them internally, you buffer yourself against the quitting circuit, this norepinephrine circuit we were talking about before. You are building a stronger version of yourself completely between your own ears. And some people say, well, that's silly. It's like you're saying, oh, I'm going to jump up and down, reward myself for doing nothing. No, you're building the neural circuits that you can control self-reward. And in doing that, you can push through days and weeks of effort consistently. I don't mean necessarily all-nighters, but you can push and push and push. You know, my career is one that was made over 2 decades. It wasn't, we had our big, peaks and we had a lot of valleys, but learning to control these rewards is absolutely key. And I know you've done this too, Tom. It's like, the huge wins are great.
In fact, there's a much better way to maintain ongoing action toward a goal that also involves visualization, but it turns out it's not about visualizing success. It's about visualizing failure. The Balcetis lab and other labs have looked at whether or not people make progress toward goals of different types, whether or not they're thinking about the goal, they're thinking about that goal line and what they want to achieve, that long-term goal and all the wonderful things associated with it, or whether or not they're thinking about all the ways in which they could fail en route to that goal, right? This is not typically what we are encouraged to do. Typically, we are told, don't imagine failure, push failure out of your mind, only focus on success, fake it till you make it, or it's a phrase that I absolutely hate, frankly, because it's not even clear what that means, and it's not even clear what the ethical form of that is. I think it means continue despite any anxiety or fear that things won't work out. But if you look at the literature, the scientific literature, what the Balcetis lab and other labs have shown is that there's a near doubling in the probability of reaching one's goal if you focus routinely on foreshadowing failure. You think about the ways in which things could fail if you take action A or you take action B, and instead, therefore, you take action C. You're supposed to think about how things could fail if you don't get up and run each morning if your goal is, say, a fitness goal. So let's use that as an example, because even though I realize people are in pursuit of many things, not just fitness goals and physical goals are a very concrete thing that we can all get on the same page about because they're related to actions. Let's say somebody sets a goal of running 5 miles 4 times a week minimum and as many as 7 4 times a week minimum before 8 a.m. Okay, in a previous podcast on habits, I talked about the benefits of not necessarily setting specific times that one will do things, but setting time blocks that one will do things. So you say before 8 a.m., you're going to run 5 miles, and that's going to happen up to 7 days a week. Okay. One version of this would be, okay, sit back in a chair and think about how great you're going to feel and look if you're doing this every day, how your health is going to improve, how everything's going to, your blood markers of lipids, et cetera, are going to improve. Okay, fine. That's the visualization goal of visualizing the endpoint. Turns out that is far less effective and maybe even counterproductive compared to thinking about what's going to happen if you don't do this. The negative health outcomes that are going to occur, the disappointment you're going to have in yourself, the fact that you're going to wait until 7:30. That's not long enough for many people to run 5 miles. You go to put it on your shoes, it's going to be pouring rain or even hailing or snowing outside. And now you're not going outside unless you're somebody who's particularly motivated to do that. Okay. So foreshadowing failure turns out to be the best way to motivate toward goal pursuit. In fact, as I mentioned before, there's a near doubling in the likelihood that people will reach goals of any kind when they're constantly thinking about how bad it's going to be if they fail. if we think back to the neural circuit associated with assessing value in our goal pursuits, this makes perfect sense. The amygdala, that center of the brain that's involved in anxiety and fear and worry, well, the amygdala is one of the 4 core components of our goal setting and goal pursuit circuitry. And there's no bypassing that. There is no one listening to this or watching this whose amygdala is not involved in their goal setting and goal pursuit behavior. And so while I'd love to be able to tell you that all you should think about is rainbows and puppies and all the wonderful, rewarding things that are going to happen when you achieve your goals, the truth is you should be thinking mainly about how bad it's really going to get if you don't do it, how disappointing yourself you're going to feel, how it will negatively impact you, if not in the immediate term, in the long term, if indeed your goal is to reach your goal. So I want to emphasize that I'm not interested in encouraging people to flagellate themselves. I'm encouraging people to achieve their goals. And it turns out the best way to do that is by foreshadowing failure. And the more specific you can get by writing down or thinking about or talking about how bad it will be if you don't achieve your goals, the more likely you are to achieve those goals. I really believe that we all have some superpower that reflects, maybe this is a bit of a scientific explanation, that reflects the fact that our biology is tilted in some direction. People often think about their biology being tilted in a direction that doesn't serve them, like, oh, my parents were this, and or I'm not a good athlete, or I'm whatever. But it's also tilted in the direction of something really special. So like when I was a kid of that age, I was fascinated by animals. I was just like and so had I learned to listen to that more, I used to hide my interest in animals because I thought it was kind of it wasn't cool. Like I didn't play the guitar in college, I didn't surf. I was like I can tell you all these facts about mustelids and ferrets, like what good is that? But but I think that kind of leaning, that kind of tilt towards like that's me, like you resonate with something. And I'm not the first to say this. I think Robert Greene also said this, like adults will often remember back to a time where they interacted with something. Sometimes it's an object or sometimes it's an experience. And it just felt so good, like it kind of drew you in. I would tell your young listeners and viewers to really pay attention to that. It can seem almost trivial, like it's rarely about the thing you're looking at or the thing you're doing, but sometimes it's the sensation of running. Sometimes it's the sensation of seeing something or hearing something, because there's a hint there, and it's not really about what you're looking at or you're doing. It's that feeling. Like that feeling is your compass. Like that's your true north, because that's the feeling you want to get to find, the mate for your life, the partner for your life, the career track. And over time, you're going to pivot, right? I mean, you're not going to get it on the first try. My story is science started there. It told me right there. I felt it in that conversation with my dad, and then my compass was all over the place and spinning, and eventually it's come back. I found it, but get in touch with that feeling. And if this seems at all abstract, I would do it as an experiment. I would sit in a chair and I would think about something you don't like really don't like, and I would pay attention to what that feels like in your mind and in your body. I'm not a very somatic person. I'm not somebody who feels stuff at the level of the body. I've always felt like my emotions were in my head. So when people talk about like their emotions in their other places, I'm just like, I don't get it. But I would encourage them to think about that, and then I would encourage them to think about something they really like. It could be roller coasters, could be music, could be, get specific and to get in touch with that feeling. And that feeling is your guide. Yeah. That feeling is your compass, because the nervous system, it's not mystical. The nervous system will orient toward the things that it's best equipped to do. It really will. And animals do this naturally. My bulldog Costello never tries to be a different kind of dog. He never fetched once. First time I threw the ball, he walked to the ball, he sat down with the ball, he destroyed the ball, because that's what bulldogs do. Throw it to a retriever, they bring it back, because the brain of the retriever is wired to feel good by retrieving. Yeah. And the brain of the bulldog is good to feel good by being horizontal and pulling on things they like to tug. So I think humans, we're similar enough, but we're different in the sense that you have something installed in you that feels right. And getting in touch with that feeling is key. And I should tell that you're not going to get it right away. This is a practice you learn, like shooting basketballs or math. You do it over and over but if you get started young at 8 or 9, oh my goodness, great. And if you do it when you're 12 or even if you're 60 and you do this, you'll find that pretty soon you start steering in these directions. And I do believe there's a real physical substrate for this. It's not mysticism.
The brain is basically designed to be customized in the early part of life, and then to implement those algorithms and that circuitry for the rest of its life. And so the brain can change in adulthood, and it can change provided that there's an emphasis on some perceptual event. So in other words, if you want to change your brain as an adult, let's say you want to be less anxious, you want to learn a new language, you want to be more functional in some way, presumably. The key thing is to bring focus to some particular perception of something that's happening during the learning process. And the reason for that is that there's a neurochemical system involving acetylcholine. And it comes from these two little nuclei down in the base of the brain called nucleus basalis. All day long, you're doing things in a reflexive way. But when you do something and you think about it very intensely, acetylcholine is released from basalis at the precise neurons that were involved in that behavior, and it marks those for change during sleep or during deep rest later. So for people that want to change their brain, the power of focus is really the entry point, and the ability to access deep rest and sleep. Because most people don't realize this, but neuroplasticity is triggered by intense focus. But neuroplasticity occurs during deep sleep and rest. One of the things that's really important also to think about how the brain works in terms of plasticity and all this stuff is what the brain really wants to do is also pass as much of what it does off to reflexive behavior as possible. So, so when we're talking about focus, I think it can get a little bit vague, but it might be useful to think about like what exactly is focus and what triggers plasticity. So the brain loves to be able to just do things, pick up coffee cups and drink and walk and talk and do things and not put much energy into it. When we decide to focus, what the brain really does is it switches on a set of circuits that involve the frontal cortex and nucleus basalis and some others, and it's trying to understand duration, how long something's going to last, path, what's going to happen, and outcome, what ultimately is going to happen. So duration, path, and outcome. You know, the events of early 2020 are a good example of this. One of the reasons why it's so exhausting to be alive in 2020 is because we are now having to pay attention to duration, path, and outcome. How long is this thing going to last? When are they going to open up all businesses? Did I touch that door handle? Does it matter?
Right.
Who are the experts? Are there any experts? There are a lot of questions, whereas normally we can just move through life without having to do all that analysis. So if it's a simple example like trying to learn a new language or a new motor skill or a new way of conceptualizing something, maybe somebody's in a therapeutic process and they're trying to work through a trauma or something like that, duration, path, and outcome is built into the networks of the brain. We can do that very easily, but it takes work. And it almost has a feeling of underlying agitation and frustration. And that's because the circuits that turn on before acetylcholine are of the stress system. So when you or I decide we're going to learn something and really dig in, norepinephrine, which is adrenaline, is secreted in the brainstem and in the body, and it brings about a state of alertness. Then our attention, which is mostly a diffuse light, is brought to a particular duration, path, and outcome analysis. This would be thinking about what somebody is saying. What are they really trying to say? A hard passage of reading, a hard set of math problems, a challenging physical workout. When you do that, these two systems have to work very hard, and the adult brain doesn't really want to change the algorithms it learned in childhood. But if you do those two things, you have alertness and focus. The acetylcholine and the norepinephrine converge to mark those synapses for change. And so the way to think about neuroplasticity, if one wants to change their brain, is bring about the most intense concentration you can to something, and then later bring about the least amount of concentration to that thing. So growth mindset and these dopamine rewards that we subjectively apply are not about saying, I had a terrible day, I performed poorly, but you know what, it's great, I just feel great anyway. It's not about that. It's not about attaching your sense of reward to the ultimate goal. It's about attaching your sense of reward to the fact that you're making action steps that are generally in the right direction. The more you can reward the effort process
the better off you are at building these kinds of neural circuits and these kind of tendencies to be able to lean into anything challenging over essentially any duration. So how does this work? Like, how would somebody do this, right? Well, keeping in mind that adrenaline and epinephrine are all great for getting us into action. This is Mother Nature's way of chemically making us feel kind of agitated. Remember, stress was designed to agitate us, to move us away from things and toward things.
And I didn't have the power of concentration. I hadn't read all the good books that gun high school students read growing up. I had to learn how to speak properly. I learned how to think properly, and really learn how to commit to something that was very linear and at times was very painful. And I went to some pretty extreme things. I actually used to set a timer, and I wouldn't allow myself to get out of the chair until the timer went off.
Right.
So, and I would experience extreme agitation. But over time, I got pretty good, and now I can do long stints of work.
And when we step back and we look at what that really entails at a neurochemical level, we have reward systems in the brain. They generally fall into two categories. There are the reward systems that make you feel really good with kind of the here and now and everything that's within the confines of your skin and the things you already have. You know, love of your dog, love of your spouse, gratitude for all the things you happen to have. And those are generally governed by the release of molecules like serotonin and oxytocin, okay? But then there's another reward system, which is the one that drove a lot of human evolution, which is the dopamine reward system. Now, dopamine is a very misunderstood molecule. It's often talked about only in the context of reward. Like, I'm going to work to this goal, I'm going to build my company, I'm going to, get tenure as a professor, whatever it is, and you reach it and you get this dopamine reward. And indeed, that's true. But what's often not discussed is that dopamine is secreted en route to rewards while you pursue rewards. Now, the ability to tap into that system, to subjectively amplify that pathway of reward in pursuit of goals, is an absolute game changer when it comes to things like anything challenging that of long duration or uncertainty or getting through this COVID, pandemic situation. But the amazing thing is, remember, the brain only does 5 things, and we get to decide which of those sensations and perceptions have relevance and which ones don't, or which ones are attached to a goal and which ones aren't. So growth mindset, in its purest form, is the attachment of these reward systems to the effort process, to the friction process, and not just to obtaining a reward. And just as a kind of final point to that, there's a very well-known body of literature in neuroscience, at least among neuroscientists, that talks about something called reward prediction error. And it says, if you can dose the dopamine subjectively as you go through the pursuit of something, and then have a lot of dopamine when you reach that thing, it's very likely that you're going to reinforce that circuit. There will be neural plasticity, and that circuit will become stronger. So the next time you will revisit those sets of behaviors. The opposite can happen too, where you're in real anticipation of something. This is going to be great. This is going to be great. This is going to be great. And then you reach that goal and it's kind of underwhelming. And that generally triggers this circuit that I referred to earlier, this kind of disappointment or pro-depressive circuit. So dopamine is involved in reward, but it's also involved in the pursuit of rewards. And so as you reach a milestone, or as you tell yourself, I'm on the right track, this friction I'm feeling, this late night, this early morning, this hard conversation with somebody that doesn't feel good, I'm going to tell myself this is for a larger purpose. That's that subjective insertion, that abstraction that we were talking about earlier. And when you start releasing dopamine to those kinds of things, there's essentially no limit on the number of things you can do or the energy to do them. So just as a last point about dopamine, when we're in effort, we're always secreting adrenaline. We're always in pursuit, and it's draining. It's tiring. Dopamine has this beautiful capacity to buffer adrenaline. And you know this, you've experienced this before, because if you've ever been working really, really hard, maybe your team is depleted, everything's just a mess, and somebody cracks a joke, and all of a sudden, in an instant, it's like everything's reframed. That couldn't have been hormonal. Hormones work on the schedule of like hours to days to weeks. It had to be neurochemical. It absolutely had to be neurochemical, and that neurochemical is dopamine.
Dude, what you just described is literally the scientific breakdown of how you turn your life around. I will just tell people that subjective insertion is one of the most powerful concepts I have ever heard in neuroscience. You're the only one I've ever heard articulate it that succinctly.
We can all apply these mechanisms and these neurochemical reward schedules. So the study that you're referring to is a beautiful one. There's a classic study where researchers, not my lab, put 2 rats, or you could do this with mice, into a tube. And the tendency is for them to try and push one or the other one out. One always wins and pushes the other one out. We call the one that got pushed out the loser, the one that pushed them out the winner. Here are the interesting things about this. First of all, the winner will tend to win in other battles, even though these are just pushing battles, more because it simply won the time before. The loser, by losing, will tend to lose. And so people say, oh, well, that explains a lot about society, etc. Well, here's where it gets really interesting. You can even take a mouse or a rat and push it from behind and make it the winner. And then on subsequent trials where you're not pushing it, it will tend to win more often. So the win doesn't even have to come from itself. So last year, there was a very important paper published about this where a set of researchers just said, well, what is it? Like, what is this winning circuit and this losing circuit? Enough with the demonstration that this happens. Like, what's happening what's under the hood? And so they went into the brain and they identified a brain area, which is part of the frontal cortex, the area that we typically think about planning, action, executive function, all the kind of high level stuff. And what they discovered was this brain area is more active in the winner than in the loser. In fact, they could take the loser and overstimulate this area and turn the losers into winners. Now, it gets even more ridiculous than that. If you quiet this brain area, winners become losers, okay? And if you take a winner and let's say at this tube battle and you put them into, let's say, a cold environment with a bunch of other mice and you have just a warm corner, mice don't like to be cold, and you say, who gets the warm corner, right? Who gets the luxury spot? It's always the winner. So it even breaks down at the level of social interactions. And so you say, okay, all right, now we know that it's this brain area, it's this one area of the frontal cortex, but what's it actually doing, right? Okay, what's it actually, how can we translate this? Turns out this brain area that's responsible and required for winning in this series of experiments is actually driving up the level of activation, what you and I would call agitation or stress, to the point where that animal is more likely to move forward. It's simply taking stress, which is wired into us in order to make us feel agitated, instead of suppressing us, instead of saying, I'm just going to sit here, I'm overwhelmed, I'm just going to move into action. So there's a circuit for winning. There's the same circuit when it's hypoactive, not active enough, is what causes losing in these competitive scenarios. And similarly, there's a circuit for quitting. There's a norepinephrine circuit in the brainstem. This was published in the last couple of years, showing that when animals or people are in constant effort, eventually that level of norepinephrine gets so high that it triggers a circuit that shuts down the motor control over the limbs, and you just say, that's it, I give up, I'm done. So these mechanisms were hardwired into us. We all have them. Whether or not it's from evolution, Mother Nature, God, the universe, it's irrelevant to the discussion that these circuits exist in everybody. And I think it's a select few people who really understand that forward action is what drives these circuits. It's the ability to take that agitation, stress, agitation, increase our focus, and they bias us for movement. And nature wanted that. They want us to move forward in the face of challenge, not to be quiescent. We weren't sitting around battling tigers and saber-toothed tigers all the time. More likely, we were in caves and we were getting hungry and we had to go out and search for things. Agitation and stress were designed to get us up and move us. And when we try and fight that too much and we try and quiet that stress, that actually can be problematic. You have to decide, are you going to try and quiet stress or are you going to actually lean into action? That's a critical choice point for everybody who's experienced anything negative or positive for that matter.
Dude, that is so useful in terms of getting people to understand how to get themselves out of it. And this goes back to this notion that your thoughts are ultimately a choice. Like, you get to decide what you think about.
The mind plays an important role in interpreting whether or not it's overwhelming or tolerable. So intense breathing like Tumo breathing, or ice baths or cold showers, or intense exercise like high intensity interval training type stuff, teaches the mind to be comfortable in these higher stress states, where, in other words, it teaches people to be comfortable when they have a lot of adrenaline in their body. This is basically stress inoculation. But stress inoculation is not about not getting stressed. It's actually about divorcing the mind-body relationship a bit so that you're calm in the mind when your body is very amplified.
Stress.
Yeah, so if you've ever done Tumo-type breathing or you've done a cold shower, the goal is to get the adrenaline release.
And then calm your mind.
And then calm your mind. But both those things, breathing and vision, also run in reverse, meaning if we change our pattern of breathing, we change our inner state. If our state changes, our breathing changes. So it's reciprocal, it's bidirectional. Likewise with vision, when we are excited or stressed, the aperture of our visual window shrinks. We get that soda straw view of the world. When we are relaxed, the aperture of our vision expands. But as well, it runs in both directions. If we expand our view of the world, literally force our visual field, or just, it's very easy actually. You can do it no matter where you are right now. If you just try and expand your visual field, not by looking around or moving your head or eyes, but by trying to see yourself in the environment that you're in. So you literally dilate your view so you could see the ceiling and the floor and the walls if you're inside, or if you're outdoors, seeing as big an aperture of your visual field or your visual environment as possible.
So you're directing your attention to, even though you might remain looking straight ahead, you're just directing your attention to as wide a peripheral view, horizontally and vertically as possible. Is that what you mean?
That's right, exactly. So essentially, if you keep your head and eyes mostly stationary, you don't have to be, rigid about rock steady, but if you look forward and you expand your field of view, so you kind of relax your eyes so that you can see as much of your environment around you as possible, to the point where you can see yourself in that environment. What you do is you are turning off the attentional and, believe it or not, the stress mechanisms that drive your internal state towards stress. This is why when you go to a vista or you view a horizon, it's very relaxing, because you naturally go into panoramic vision. When you are indoors, you're looking at your phone, you're looking at a computer or a camera or something of that sort, or you're talking to somebody or an intense conversation, you may not notice it, but your entire visual field shrinks to a much smaller aperture. And that drives an increase in alertness in internal state. And we sometimes call that stress if it's a negative experience. If it's a positive experience, we might call that love or obsession or fascination. But the important thing to realize is that both vision and breathing have a profound and very rapid effect on our internal state of mind and body, and it runs in both directions. Our internal state that could be triggered by a text message or hearing something that somebody says drives changes in our breathing and our vision, but our breathing and our vision can also drive changes in our internal state. And so that article in Scientific American was a discussion about how we can leverage the visual system and the respiration, the breathing system, in order to take control over our internal state. Because it's not just that 2020 was stressful, it's that our internal state determines everything. It doesn't just determine if we feel like we're having a hard time falling asleep or we're having a hard time focusing, for instance. It also determines how we batch time, how we analyze where we are in the world in terms of our lifespan. A good example of this would be when we are very stressed, we fine slice time. This is why when people are in a car accident or something, they might report that things were in slow motion. They're actually, your frame rate increases. Whereas when you're very relaxed, your frame rate slows down. And when we are relaxed, we get so-called perspective. We are able to say, well, this too shall pass, or I can place this stressful event in a context. So one thing that's just fundamental to how our nervous system works is that we are constantly placing our experience, both our immediate and past experience, as well as our anticipation of the future, into some sort of larger context. And our visual system, literally how we are viewing the world at that moment, dictates how we create perspective in terms of states of mind. Sounds a little bit abstract, but it's actually, it boils right down to optics of the eye and very concrete things like how you move your eyes and how you view the world. Growth mindset, which is the academic discovery and laboratory discovery of my colleague Carol Dweck at Stanford, is the hallmark of growth mindset is really two things. One is I'm not where I want to be now, but I'm capable of getting there eventually. The other is to attach a sense of reward to the effort process itself. In fact,
don't reward the result, reward the effort.
That's right. And if you look at true high performers, people that are consistently good at what they do, they don't peak and go through the postpartum depression and crash and come back, and their life is a cycle of ups and downs, but really people who are on that upward trajectory consistently, those people attach dopamine to the effort process. And actually, Carol's one of her original studies on the discovery of growth mindset was these kids that loved doing math problems that they knew they couldn't get right. So it's like the people love puzzles, but in this case, they knew they couldn't get it right, but they loved doing it. And it, incidentally or not so incidentally, these kids are fantastic at math when there is a right answer, because they feel some sense of reward from the effort process.
Yeah.
Now, the cool thing about dopamine is that it's very subjectively controlled. We can all learn to secrete dopamine in our brain in response to things that are in a purely subjective way.
Our interpretation.
But it has to be attached to reality. So, one should never confuse
what is real.
Right. So if you're thinking about the effort you're expending. So let's say somebody right now is financially back on their heels and they're setting up a new business, for instance, and it's hard. If they can take a few moments or minutes each day to reflect on the fact that the effort process is allowing them to climb out of their hole potentially, that it's giving them an opportunity, that it's somehow they are on the right path, or if they're not in movement along that path, or at least oriented on the right path, they're not lying in bed all day.
They're taking a step forward.
They're taking a step. If they can reward that process internally, two things happen. First of all, the brain circuits that are associated with building subjective rewards and dopamine get stronger, so you get better at that process. And second, and most importantly, dopamine has an amazing ability to buffer adrenaline and buffer epinephrine. And what I mean by that is there was a study that was published in the journal Cell, excellent journal, Cell Press Journal, a couple years ago, showing that with repeated bouts of effort, we use and we release more and more epinephrine. It's kind of adrenaline, but in the brain.
With more effort, we're
every time you put in effort. So every time you make, for this, let's keep it, if I were to keep it in the business context, every time you write that email, every time you, let's see, it's a person who's a craftsman or a craftswoman, every time you're working in the shop and doing that, every bit of effort, you're taking a little bit of money out of this epinephrine account. You're spending epinephrine. At some point, those levels of epinephrine get high enough that you feel like quitting. It feels exhausting. And this was done in a beautiful study, actually, where they control the visual environments and they have the subjects exert effort. And they can control the visual environment. So sometimes the effort of taking steps and moving forward, this is actually kind of pushing forward in kind of swimming motion, would give them the sensation that they were actually making progress. And other times it was an exercise in futility where they would just keep the visual world stationary and they would expend effort and they didn't think they were going anywhere.
My gosh.
Epinephrine's climbing, and eventually they quit. Now dopamine is able to push back on that epinephrine and give you, anyone, the feeling that you could continue. And maybe even the feeling that you want to continue. And you've seen this actually, like football is a good example. Two teams play, say the Super Bowl. Both teams are max effort the entire time.
Yeah.
Max effort. The team that wins, suddenly, in a moment, has the energy to jump all over the place, party for days. They can talk, they have
exhausted
energy.
right before
That's right.
then.
Well, that wasn't glycogen or stored energy of any kind, except it was neural energy. And what happened was, effort is this adrenaline. Eventually, people quit. They just quit. The dopamine is able to suppress that. And so then you're expending effort, but you're doing it from a place of feeling like you have energy for it.
There was a paper published that essentially was asking why any human or animal quits at any behavior. Now, certain behaviors, like I can't lift a car, unless it's a very small car. I can't lift a car. But if we're talking about running, or we're talking about long bouts of work, the question is, why do we quit? Like, what is that? And it turns out that every time we exert effort, a certain amount of noradrenaline in the brain is released. And there's a sort of a counter in the brainstem. And at some point, enough noradrenaline is released, and it shuts down cognitive control, deliberate control over the motor circuitry, and we quit. That's it. But the thing that can restore those levels, or it can sort of reset those levels lower and give us more gas, more mileage, is dopamine. And it makes perfect sense because our species had to move against very challenging things in nature and in terms of in culture at every stage of our evolution, including now. 2020 is a good example of this. And when a good example would be, if you're really slogging it out and things are miserable, just think like the worst family vacation, everything's a disaster, or a very hard physical event, and someone cracks a joke, you almost immediately feel a sense of relief. You see this in the team that wins the Super Bowl. Both teams slogged it out. You have to believe they were both at max effort the entire game. Look at the team that wins. They have extra energy. They're jumping all over the place. So it can't be physical energy. It can't be glycogen related. It's not ketone related. It's nothing in the body in that sense. It's dopamine's ability to take that level of norepinephrine and smack it back down. And so we can learn this, right? I mean, I think this is where there's real power, like in your story, or the story that I'm familiar with from your book, like the ability to push through those pain points is something that we really can export to other aspects of life, because it's the same neurochemicals that are involved. So when you get to a particular location, or maybe I recall, a portion where you're feeling lousy, you're injured or you feel like you're hurt, and you can reframe it mentally and think, I'm actually still on the ladder. I'm still holding on to a rung. I know at least that much. I'm still breathing. I know that much. And the lift that we get is not some psychological pump up. It's a neurochemical thing. It's dopamine suppressing norepinephrine and saying, you're on the right path. You can keep going. It's a permission to keep going. And we grant that permission to ourselves. No one grants that permission to us. I think one of the other kind of misconceptions that we want to dissolve is this idea that external rewards can actually propel us down long paths of success and high performance. They can't.
No, that's
internal
an unsustainable
rewards.
Fuel source.
Yeah. I have a friend from the SEAL teams, and somebody asked us recently, we were given a talk, and somebody said, how can I make sure that I continue to self-reward and I'm not driven by these external rewards? How can I continue to have that drive? And his answer was very good. He said, give away all the external rewards. Now, not everyone can afford to do that.
It's just about you and you.
It's just you and you. And the more attached, there's a famous Stanford study done at Bing Nursery School, probably not far from where you were in the dormitory. There's a little nursery school in Escondido Village. And they did this study where they looked at kids that liked to playing during their recess. It's all recess in nursery school, but they're drawing. And they took the kids that really like to draw, and they started giving them little gold stars on their drawings. And then they like the gold stars for a kid, that's an extrinsic reward. And then they stopped doing that, and the kids stopped drawing. They associated the good feeling of doing it with the external rewards. We have to be very cautious about how much of our internal dopamine we attach to external rewards if we want to continue to grow and pursue and focus and work hard. If you just want to get to some place and cash in, then fine. But most people find themselves in a pretty miserable place because their dopamine was so attached to external rewards, they need more and more of that.
Breathing can be used to shift the brain into different states. And I've talked to David about this, and so I'm sort of borrowing from his words here, so I want to be fair that these are from those conversations. So hypnosis inevitably involves relaxing the nervous system, taking the nervous system into states that are more like sleep. Now, what I mean by that is in high alert states where you're talking and planning and in action and stress in particular, the brain is very linear. It's saying, okay, if this, then this, if then that. This is why we tend to be forward thinking when we're stressed. We tend to be not in our immediate experience, but really kind of forward thinking. So clinical hypnosis involves going into a state of deeper relaxation so that our analysis of space and time, meaning the way that the brain is perceiving events, is slightly dismantled so that it's a little bit dreamlike. And then the hypnotist, and this could be by listening to a script or listening to a hypnotherapist, starts to narrow our context, take our thoughts, if you will, down a particular path. And that path could be one of stress reduction or smoking cessation. Hypnosis incidentally is very good for treatment of smoking cessation or for feelings of well-being or confronting traumas. So what it is it's really opening up the window for neural plasticity, which is, of course, the brain's ability to change in response to experience. To trigger neural plasticity, you have to have focus, especially as an adult. You need acetylcholine released, but high levels of attention, acetylcholine and norepinephrine together. Norepinephrine to create that sense of urgency, and acetylcholine to bring that spotlight of focus in really, really tight. That triggers plasticity. but it marks certain synapses in the brain for change. But the actual changes in the synapses, the rewiring, okay, that happens during states of sleep and deep rest. So this is why when you're trying to learn a motor skill, you go and your tennis serve, it's not happening. You take a break, you come back and you nail it. You're like, wait, what happened? Well, you needed time to set those circuits in motion and allow them to do their rewiring, the sort of adaptation. Hypnosis seems to capture both the high attentional state and the deep relaxation at the same time. It's this very unusual state of mind where you're neither asleep nor awake and in tight focus or narrow focus. And it's very clear that it leads to these rapid changes in behavior because you're rewiring the brain. And the reason you're able to rewire the brain so quickly is because you're getting the trigger event, the focus, and you're also getting the relaxation event simultaneously. And so it's much faster than separating out the learning trigger from the actual rewiring of the brain. My lab has a deep interest, and David Spiegel's lab has a deep interest now in using respiration or breathing to shift our state to either heightened states of focus and alertness to open up neuroplasticity.
Dopamine is not just about reward. It's one of the biggest misconceptions. Dopamine is about motivation and drive. It's like a jet that propels you along a path.
So how do we get more dopamine?
You practice subjectively releasing dopamine in your mind.
Like how?
Okay, so that's a great question. First of all, there are ways you can get more dopamine release through thoughts or through drugs or through supplements. I want to be really clear. There is a drug, there are two drugs actually, that will cause massive release of dopamine. They're called cocaine and methamphetamine. The problem
That's what gets us addicted because it feels so good.
The problem is cocaine and methamphetamine stimulate so much dopamine release that the drug becomes the only source. It becomes the goal and the path. It becomes the path and the destination. And you look at people's lives when they do a lot of cocaine and methamphetamine, and that baseline on their life goes. Dopamine is this incredibly powerful molecule that allows us to buffer the effort process. It allows us to be in effort longer, and it allows us to actually eventually enjoy the process of effort.
And not think about the reward, but just say, oh, I'm enjoying the process.
Right. Well, you just described the first step. The first step in learning to attach dopamine to the effort process, which is the key operation in order to succeed, is to be very careful about how much you focus on the end goal. Keeping the goal in mind is important for like a proper orientation. You have to know the ultimate destination. But if at any point we were to evaluate our progress relative to that end goal, or if we don't know what the end goal is, there's a huge gap there, and it can feel overwhelming. The key to this is, if we want to be very concrete, we should probably focus on actions. And I'll use fitness as an example because it translates to everybody, whereas people's circumstance is different. Let's say somebody really wants to take on a fitness routine. They hate running, or they want to lose weight in a healthy way, this kind of thing. So we've all heard the example, well, you put your shoes by the door on day 1. Day 2, you put them on. Day 3, you go out the door. Day 4, you walk around the block, and then, and then eventually like they're running marathons. Okay, great. But to sustain that behavior, or even to make the behavior pleasurable and to give you energy, the key is to subjectively reward those steps. So it's not going to be, let's say I go out and I run a mile, and my goal is to run 10 miles in a few weeks. The key is, as you're in the strain of that mile, the hard part, you want to tell yourself, this is the good part. This is the part that gives me energy. And I'll be very surprised if people don't actually feel like they could continue further. So it's a journey of 1,000 miles starts with is made up of single steps. But the key is to reward the harder steps, not the easier ones, and not the ones where you get the thing that you want. There's a process I'm going through right now where I'm trying to write a book, and it's hard. And I was told that the harder it is, the better I'm probably doing it. And I was like, great. And my editor's ready to kill me, and because I'm slow, and I know, and I'm a very slow person. I drive people crazy. I'm like glacially slow because science is slow, and I like to get things right.
You want to rush it. Yeah.
I like to get things right, but I'm very proud of the fact that everything we've published, I can stand behind. It was the best we could do with the tools at the time, and I just know that when I look back on a writing career or a scientific career, I want to be able to say, every journal we put it in was rock solid. Everything was rock solid. We had fun doing it. The relationship. So I go slow. Yeah. But as a consequence, what I'm finding is there are a lot of interferences these days. I think social media is great. I teach neuroscience on social media because I think it's important to do public education.
But it's a distraction too.
But it's incredible. And it's incredible how much time and energy it can take. So what I've started doing now is I turn off my phone and I lock it in a safe. And I experience extreme anxiety.
Right?
It's so weird.
Why is that? Is it because it gives you so much dopamine that when you're not having it?
Well, this is scary because I actually think, brief anecdote, on the weekend I was driving, there's a kid that I mentor, and I picked up my phone and I was texting while I was driving. And he said to me, this was really embarrassing for me. He said, I wish you wouldn't text while you drive. And I put it down and I realized, this is crazy. I know that my life and his life is far more important, and the lives of the people around me are far more important than any text message, which means I wasn't doing it rationally. It's just pure reflex at this point. So I don't think I pick up the phone because I don't even know what I'm looking for there anymore. It's just become reflexive.
Wow.
So for me lately, the longer I can keep that phone in a safe and write on a grant or this book, what I tell myself is the agitation is good. At least I'm not doing that. And then I find that as I start to write and I get into the process, I start feeling good about it, and I'll pause and say, okay, I have control. I have ultimate control over my behavior. I can put that thing away. There might be a nuclear war out there, and I'm just doing this anyway. I have control over my thoughts, my feelings, and behavior. So I tell myself that, and then I find I have immense energy, and all I want to do is write. And I kind of tunnel into the process.
Wow.
And I think that sometimes people need to write these things out for themselves so it's really concrete. I think some people are so unskilled at subjective rewards that writing it out is really powerful.
So what would you write out for yourself as a subjective reward for this experience?
As long as I'm writing, I'm on the right path. As long as I'm not writing, I'm looking at my phone, I'm not on the right path. Because for me, the 2 or 3 things that are most important for my career are writing grants, working on this book manuscript, and writing scientific manuscripts. I mean, there are other things as well.
And anything else that you're not doing is holding you back from doing that.
That's right.
So you need to be focused, set our mouths forward on doing those things.
That's right. So I don't do any jumping around, power poses, things like that. I will use tools to kind of ramp up my dopamine. There are certain songs that are really embedded in my emotional thing that go back to, when I was a, wild, skateboarding punk rock teenager that will get me fired up. And I think there's real utility. That's pure dopamine.
A lot of people, hashtag growth mindset is one of the most popular hashtags in social media, but most people don't actually know what it means. And again, this is Carol Dweck's discovery, not mine. It was discovered in a group of kids that were doing math problems or other kinds of puzzles that they knew they couldn't get right, but they enjoyed doing them, and they perform exceedingly well on lots of sorts of tests of that sort when there is a right answer, of course. And so what they do is they're wired for effort. They're wired for the puzzle, not for the solution. And when I say puzzle, I don't mean the noun puzzle. I mean the verb for being puzzled. It, for them, feels good. Yeah. And so we need to think, if we're talking about the nervous system and we want to make it actionable for high performance, whether or not it's in business or sport or otherwise, we want to think in terms of processes, not events, and verbs, not nouns. So growth mindset as a verb, as an action item, reward as a verb, not just as you're going to just pat yourself on the back. It's what you internalize. It's a process. That's how the neural circuits that underlie reward get stronger. And the beauty of the brain is that you have this thing of neuroplasticity, which is its ability to change itself throughout the whole lifespan. And the more you practice this, the better you get at it. And it does not mean you're walking around talking delusionally about how great life is when everything is terrible. It means you might even be very stoic. You might be, hopefully you're very rational, but you have the energy to.
For everybody. One is cold water, which is great because most of the time it can't kill you, right? It's not like heat, which can kill you. It's cold water and sleep deprivation. And so the ability to do these, like what I'm calling DPOs, this duration, path, and outcome steps and procedures, is great on when you're rested. When you're well fed, well slept, you can do anything. You can be in any hard conversation. You can work through anything. So what they do is they start taking the autonomic nervous system, which is these deep reserves of the nervous system, that when our autonomic nervous system is off, it starts making us pay more attention to how we feel than the demands of the world around us. Remember that basic challenge in the nervous system. And so sleep deprivation is the best way that you can pull somebody down from their ability to analyze duration, path, and outcome and reward themselves. Sleep deprivation is the way in which you essentially pull apart the nervous system and the way that it wants to function, because it's very easy, again, rested to do all this. But so what they do is they're sleep deprived people, they put them in cold water. They're trying to get them more in touch with the way that they feel inside than what they need to do in response to the external demands.
Right.
And everyone I know that's made it through that process did it slightly differently, but I'll tell you how they didn't do it. They didn't do it through sheer grit and determination. They did it through attaching a sense of meaning. They did it by micro slicing the day, or slicing the day into a series of meals that they just needed to get to, and then rewarding themselves for getting to that next milestone. So they don't know, I mean, most of them, probably had very low concept of dopamine and norepinephrine, but that's the process. That's also the process, I think, that allows someone to finish an ultra. I've never run an ultra, but I think that process of self-reward is grit and resilience in a kind of neurochemical definition.
Yeah.
And I think it's the thing that anybody can tap into. And I think it's so key, because I think people think that it's just so key that people understand, that these circuits are not unique to people who run ultras or people that make it through, stringent filter, special operations command. It's the same thing that
it is
anyone
interesting.
could do.
Yeah.
So why fear? Why do we have fears? Why do we have trauma? Why do we have shame? And here's the stinger. It was all set up for you in your youth. I don't want to focus on the bad, but most of this stuff when you're young, you're just a passive learning machine. It's all coming in. Little kids are learning 3 languages with no accents flexibly. They're not even thinking about it. They're learning instruments. Someone asked a great question the other day at the workshop. Wait, now I know I want all that stuff. How come it's so much tougher? And there's a lot of biology that I'd be happy to tell you about that explains why that all shuts down after these so-called critical periods during development. So what happens when you're an adult and you want to change your brain? So now I'm going to get into stuff that hopefully is useful to you. Okay, so these basic facts, that changing your brain in a real way as an adult requires that you do particular things that activate particular chemical systems in your brain. So how do you do that, right? I could tell you all about the chemicals, and I'll tell you a little bit about them, but how do you do it? Okay, so this is a right here, right now, urgent situation, car wreck. It's terrible. You could imagine any other trauma in its place. When that happens, a little area in the base of the brain, the name isn't important, but if you care, it's called nucleus basalis, does its job, which is it's an alert system. It puts all its attention on right here, right now, get everybody safe. It's your alert system. And it has this effect of dumping out a certain chemical called acetylcholine at specific locations in the brain that are paired with that experience. And forever, that experience will be traumatic unless something else is done. Okay? So there's some nuance and some details to this, but that pretty much summarizes it. It's been replicated many, many times in dozens of studies. You can pair pretty much any experience with stimulation of nucleus basalis, this thing in the base of the brain, and that experience will be mapped or remapped in your brain as an adult. And that's remarkable. It's also exciting because then someone like me says, well, then how do I change my experience? How do I change the meaning of what happens? How do I change something from traumatic to positive? The good news is nucleus basalis is just a slave to whatever is exciting, traumatic. It likes emotion. It likes peaks and lows. And so if acetylcholine is released, that means you can massively change your brain at that moment with whatever's paired with it. And so when you get into a peak state here and you're jumping up and down, or in a really low state and you're thinking how miserable something is, you have to be really careful because those are the things that you're wiring in, all right? So you can move to a state like this about driving later if you form enough associations with driving. But to really eliminate, to override the fear, you need to create a positive experience in its place. So how do you do that? So I'm gonna tell you that the way to do that is not to think too hard and to not verbalize things too much. And this is coming from someone who spent 25 years, 3 times a week on a couch, letting subconscious things geyser up. And that's where I really learned that it was really the things that you don't realize that have the potential to have the most impact. But this power of emotion, the ability to couple really strong emotions with things, is so useful if you want to change your brain for the better. And the way you do that is clear in the physical space. We all know this story. There are many news cases like this. Woman's child stuck under car, superhuman strength. We heard a lot of amazing stories about desperation. JJ's story was one of desperation. She's like, no, I'm not going to accept failure because failure in the case she was describing was potentially the death of her child. So desperation is a strong one, and it's motivated by fear. But what if you're not in a desperate state and you really want to do something? In that case,
There's something remarkable. And then we should ask ourselves, why are children such great passive learners? They're not trying, they're just learning. They're coming home with all sorts of things, sometimes things you don't want them to come home with, right? It's because they have this element of play. And what is play? Play isn't just movement, although it includes movement. It's giving things everything you've got, but keeping it in perspective. It's that sweet spot of enjoying life and trying really, really hard at it at the same time. It's essentially what we all strive for. And there are these incredible cases throughout history. Famous scientists, because I grew up in a house where people, revered scientists like Richard Feynman, Nobel Prize winner. He's most famous for bongo drumming naked on the roof of Caltech. And he became an amazing artist in his 60s. And he developed all sorts of other skills. And he always had this childlike way of looking at the world. He never let himself get stuck in his ways, never became a curmudgeon, and a remarkable man. And that's something that if you come away with nothing else, I encourage you to do that. You want your brain to change, stay light, stay loose, but give it everything you've got.
Can a person make it so they never get depressed? They never react to their perception, their people's actions towards them, where they never get to a state of, I don't feel good, I'm feeling more depressed, I'm in a dark place now, I'm stuck in this place. Is there a way that we could ever defend ourselves against negative stressors, negative emotions? Or do we need them as well to have contrast in life?
Well, there's sort of two views on this. I'll reveal mine after I explain the two views. One is that these states, I guess I'm automatically calling things like depression a state of mind and body. So when I say state of mind, I mean brain and body.
Because your body is really feeling, it's like the brain is connected to the body.
Right.
And so if you're saying internally the thought of like, I'm depressed, or I don't feel good, or I'm sad, or I'm lonely, or I'm not good enough, the body's going to react. Is that what I'm understanding?
Absolutely.
Like the body's going to manifest what the mind is telling you.
Absolutely.
The thought, the idea, you're going to be like, I'm sad, I'm not good enough. You're going to shrink.
Right.
Is that right?
That's right. I mean, there are really two forms of depression. Sometimes they're intermixed, but one is anxiety-associated depression. And you, if you've ever experienced it, or for anyone that's experienced it, they feel agitation in their body. And their mind races, but in their body. So the body is recruited. There are also depressive states that people feel very fatigued and exhausted. It's an overwhelm. And they also experience that in their body. The idea of getting out of bed in the morning is hard, motivating to exercise, doing the sorts of things that we know are powerful for pushing back on depression. Mm-hmm. So the body is recruited. I think most people would say that depressive states are bad when they bring down the baseline on life. As a brief aside, anytime there's a question about mental health or addiction or trauma or anything, one could look at it and make up some argument of, well, evolutionarily, this makes sense, we all get depressed, but we have to be fair to the person experiencing it, of course, and have sensitivity that some behaviors will keep the baseline of our life steady, meaning job, relationships, etc., will continue as they are. Other activities will tend to improve the baseline on our life. Job, activities, relationship, etc., will improve. And then there's some things like heroin, which does very quickly, we can predict that very quickly the baseline on life is going to creep down regardless of who that person is, right? So people say, can you get addicted to water? Well, maybe, but I have to drink a lot of water before the baseline of my life starts to go down.
So it just feels uncomfortable.
That's
right.
It's
like, man, I'm so bloated
exactly.
all day.
So we tend to throw around things like addiction and depression a little loosely. So
yeah.
I think that it's fair to say that depression is wired into us as a possible state that we could all fall into, but that it's very important, in my opinion, that humans have tools to remove themselves from that state. Mm-hmm. Of course, to avoid tragedies like suicide, but also because when the baseline on someone's life goes down far enough, they find it increasingly hard to do the sorts of things that are going to get them out of depression. So you or I could say...
So they stay in that state of depression because
that's right.
It's too hard to go work out. It's too hard to change my habit of eating healthier, so I'm going to stay... I'm going to keep eating ice cream, which is going to make my body... depressed.
That's right.
Right? If I keep eating bad foods, if I keep staying up till 4 a.m., if I keep staying in a toxic relationship, I'm going to feel depressed.
That's right. And eventually, because of this very inseparable relationship between the brain and body, eventually what happens is that because the brain controls the body, but also the body can control the brain, people lose the ability to intervene in this depressive process. So you or I could say, look, if someone who's depressed, what they need to do is get up early, get some light in their eyes, get some movement. I know you put this information out there, which I love, because those tips are grounded in, they're not even tips, they're really tools.
Yes.
And they're very powerful because they're grounded in excellent science. You get that dopamine release early in the day that's antidepressive. You time your sleep better when you get sun in your eyes, and you get movement early in the day. For most people, that's accessible, and they absolutely should be doing it. Everyone should be doing that. But for people who are far enough down that path of depression, because the body and the mind have this relationship that's so close, there is a crossover point where they really can't do those activities.
Because they're so far deep into depression?
The body won't do what they decide to do. And so, now I'm not trying to give anyone a pass, because ultimately we are all responsible for our own mental health. Certainly adults more than kids, but we're all responsible for our own mental health, and only we can direct our own brain changes. That's the stinger. Once we're 25 years and older, we are the only ones that can change our brain. And we can talk about neuroplasticity if you like, but the depressed person has to take responsibility for their behavior. But this is why it's so important to catch this brain-body relationship early and build routines that keep one out of depression. So that was a long path back to answer your question succinctly, I hope, which is we can stay out of depression, but we have to keep depression at bay by doing things regularly.
We have these so-called receptors in the eyes, in the ears, in the nose, in the mouth, on the skin, that take physical entities in the universe that are real fixed, non-negotiable things like sound waves and photons of light and chemicals in the environment traveling that make it into our nose and things like that, and convert those into the second thing, which is perceptions. So the nervous system's responsibility is to take those sensations, which are non-negotiable, and perceive certain ones and not others. So for instance, right now, until I say, what's the sensation of your feet contacting the floor or the bottoms of your shoes? You weren't thinking about it, but those pressure receptors were being engaged the entire time. So your perception is like a window or a spotlight that's very much linked to attention. Then there are emotions, often called feelings. And those are really designed to push us down particular avenues of perception. And the next thing, which are thoughts. Okay, so we've got sensation, perception, feelings, and then there are thoughts, which really have a lot to do with what we're perceiving and the way we're organizing those perceptions, what they mean. And generally that's put into the context of what we already know, or memories. And then the fifth thing is behaviors or actions. And of course, neurons are responsible for generating actions, and there are really two kinds of actions. There are the actions that you generate reflexively, like your breathing and your heart rate right now are largely reflexive, or you could decide control of your respiration and make it voluntary, right? And not just reflexive. So those five things, sensations, perceptions, feelings, thoughts, and actions, really encompass all of our life experience. And that's from the very mundane of getting up in the morning and brushing your teeth to the most awe-inspiring, goal-motivated, pinnacle moments of your life. The nervous system, not the immune system, not the digestive system, all of which are important, but the nervous system, meaning the brain, spinal cord, and the connections with the body and the connections from the body back to the brain and spinal cord are responsible for all of that. And as just a final point, the nervous system is also responsible for telling the immune system, something that's very relevant right now in this COVID pandemic, when to be active. We don't often think about the immune system as governed by anything. I want to just mention about the diaphragm, why it's so important for these state changes, is that a lot of people talk about the vagus nerve and all this stuff. The vagus and these connections between the brain and this vagus nerve or the gut, it's what gets activated when you're really full and you eat a big meal and you feel relaxed. Those are great, but it's very slow. The diaphragm is skeletal muscle, just like your bicep, just like your tricep, just like your quadricep. It is the only internal organ, except maybe a couple muscles in your throat, that are actually skeletal muscle, meaning it was designed to be voluntarily moved. And the diaphragm isn't just designed to move your lungs, it also sends a signal through the so-called phrenic nerve back to the brain to inform your brain about the status of your body. So when you breathe fast deliberately, the reason you feel kind of an elevated sense of alertness is because Yeah, there are chemicals secreted, but mostly because the phrenic nerve is firing off. It's telling you, hey, the body's moving. We're really running now, even though you're stationary in a chair if you're doing breathing. Or if you're breathing very slowly and rhythmically, right? Box type breathing or, slow breathing. Your diaphragm is telling your brain, hey, we're calm, we're good. And you calm down very quickly on the order of seconds. And so once you start tapping into this, you start realizing, okay, movement of the body was designed to inform the brain of where to be, not just the brain telling the body. And how does the body communicate with the brain? Through the phrenic nerve from the diaphragm. So my lab is really pursuing two questions, and this is still being worked out. So I just want to highlight that it's still in progress. But certain patterns of breathing will calm you very much like entering a hypnotic state. And so you have a subset of neurons in your brainstem that are responsible for sighing. You have a subset of neurons in your brainstem responsible for coughing, subset of neurons responsible for laughter, and a subset of neurons in your brainstem for sighing. This was a paper published in Nature. This is a real thing. These neurons are every so often, and your dog does this too, you inhale twice, and then you exhale long. Now that double inhale, best done through the nose on the inhales, and then long exhale through the mouth, activates these sigh neurons that trigger the so-called calming reflex, the parasympathetic arm of the nervous system. So we have a hardwired mechanism, a set of neurons, connection to the diaphragm, and back again from the diaphragm to the brain that was designed to activate calm. And when people ask me, how should I breathe to calm myself down? I always say double inhale through the nose followed by exhales. 2 or 3 of those will reset your autonomic nervous system faster than any other mechanism we're aware of, because it's really capitalizing on a set of neural circuits. Now, once you're calm, you say, well, how do I get into plasticity states? There you want to go the other direction. That's going to be inhaling a lot more than you exhale. You're going to be driving in more oxygen than you are breathing out, generally carbon dioxide. And that will lead to states that are kind of more elevated. This is typical of things like Tumo breathing, Wim Hof breathing, Kundalini breathing. And when people enter those states, their whole world changes because it shuts off the frontal cortex. This is why sometimes people pass out or they feel like they want to get up and move. You get some odd behavior when you're doing this kind of thing. So the key is, if you want to access states of heightened plasticity, let's say you want to learn faster, or you want to be more, you want to bring more out of some physical training that you're doing. The key is to apply those principles. First, you need to focus. You need to bring yourself to that heightened state of alertness. You can breathe to do that. So this would be super oxygenated breathing. Then you want to drop into a state of calm. And you do that by a couple, maybe 2 or 3 rounds of inhale, inhale, exhale, inhale, inhale, exhale. And then now your brain is in a state, we believe, this is still again being worked out in labs like mine and David's, that then you're in a state for heightened learning, because you're in a state where neurochemicals like acetylcholine are going to be at levels that are higher than they typically would be. Things like noradrenaline, slightly higher than they typically would be, but not in a discombobulated way, in a very regulated way. And the cool thing is you're regulating them. So you could argue, earlier we were talking about subjective emotions and thoughts and all these things, but one thing that's absolutely concrete is breathing. I always think of physical exercise, movement, writing, whatever, singing, dancing, talking. Those are physical actions in the universe. Then you have thoughts, and somewhere in between those is controlling your respiration. Once you can control everything that's within the confines of your skull and skin, once you can really control that relationship, that brain-body relationship, you start to realize that relationship is a lot like any other relationship to forward action. It's just all happening within the confines of my body. So it's heightened states of focus followed by states of relaxation that are going to prime your nervous system for learning and plasticity, just like hypnosis. Sorry for the long-winded discussion. Yeah.
Don't you dare apologize. That is some of the most powerful and useful information literally ever. I can't tell you how much I love what you're studying.
How do you get motivated? Well, one way to do that is if you are good at subjectively attaching dopamine to the pursuit, just knowing, okay, I really am hungry for this. I'm going to tell myself that, making it 1% of the way is a success, and I'm going to keep going and I'm going to keep ratcheting on. And that's great if you can do that. But for people that can't do that, understanding this relationship with the pleasure-pain balance can be more powerful. just understanding the more friction and pain that you experience, the greater the dopamine reward you will get later. And that serves as its own amplifier of the whole process of pursuing more dopamine. And then the other aspect of it is that anytime that we're leaning into action, it has the possibility of being an amplifying process or a depleting process. And the key to that is making sure that you're balancing the dopamine and epinephrine systems. Epinephrine being this molecule of universal currency of energy output. It could be out of hate or it could be out of love. Epinephrine doesn't care. And actually dopamine doesn't care. None of these systems care about us. They just work underneath our conscious control. But when you start to understand that hitting the gas pedal is great, but hitting the gas pedal and then coming off the gas pedal a little bit, you can kind of sit in a more relaxed RPM, actually allows you to go much further. I think that people leaning into action is terrific. I always say you can either be back on your heels, flat-footed, or forward center of mass. The best situation is actually to be right upright, but just know that you can be forward center of mass at any point. And to take it back to sex and reproduction, because it's a salient example, the arc of sex is very interesting because when you think about autonomic arousal, it turns out that the arousal stage of sex actually involves release of dopamine, but is what we call parasympathetic dominant. It actually has to be relaxed enough in order to occur. Okay, everyone can read between the lines on this. Orgasm is actually I don't want to say full blown. It is a sympathetic nervous system driven response. It's identical to the stress system. It's driven by the same neural circuits as stress. That's so weird. And then what comes afterward? The parasympathetic system goes back up again. It's that deep relaxation. So why do I say this? Not to talk about sex to be, to serve as a highlighter, but rather our species arrived here because of this dance between arousal and relaxation. And one thing we can say for sure about every human being that's alive now is that their parents, at least once, mastered this dance of relaxed and excited, but not too excited, then really excited, and then relaxed. That dance was mastered by all of our parents, and that's what delivered us here to some extent. And so what this means is that all the neural circuits, from the ones that led to our conception to the ones that lead to us pursuing goals, have this balance. There's almost like a seesaw, right? There's activation and calm, and it's that dynamic process that's important to master in every endeavor. So we use sex as an example, but in pursuit of goals, you have to learn how to pursue short-term goals, and like the goals within the day, make a cup of coffee, and long-term goals. And when I said dopamine is what's setting your time perception, it's an interval timer. What you're saying is, it's like the 2 marshmallow experiment done at Stanford. Defer the dopamine, and actually, if you can, turn the waiting into the dopamine, and then you can extend out the reward for, waiting for the second marshmallow 15 minutes later, et cetera, et cetera. And there are many, many examples of this in the psychology and neuroscience literature. And I would say finally, in 2020, we finally as a field got a clear idea of how dopamine is really working. Because before it was all about work, dopamine hit, right? Sex gives you a dopamine hit. The internet gives you a dopamine hit. What we didn't realize is that repeated engagement with these things leads to dopamine depletion, and that the pain and pleasure balance is always at work. There are other things that, if it's a physical skill that you're trying to learn, as opposed to just a mental skill, then there's a whole kingdom of things that are fun. For instance, if it's a physical skill, you want to generate as many repetitions as you safely can per unit time. So if you say, I'm going to learn dance, you want
use a ball machine if you're playing tennis.
Exactly. You literally want to generate repetitions, and in particular, you want to generate failures. Every time you give a bad serve playing tennis, that activates the circuits for focus and alertness for the next attempt.
Yeah, it's true.
That's right.
Especially when you're losing.
That's right. And a lot of people don't like failures, and so they back away from it. So remember, the nervous system will only change if you give it a reason to do that. And the other one that's kind of an interesting twist on this is the way the nervous system is wired is it wants to pass off all of its work to circuits that are reflexive as much as it can. You don't think about walking anymore because you learned how to walk, but when you were learning, you were very focused on it. one of the things that can set the stage for more plasticity overall is when you disrupt the vestibular or the balance system. It does appear that whenever we are physically off balance, the brain is primed to pay attention, and the chemical milieu is such that it can actually rewire itself faster. And whereas I think the 90s and 2000s brought out a lot of important work on saying, hey, exercise of aerobic type or maybe even weight training can create neuroplasticity. That was great, but it wasn't directed enough. It didn't say, well, what kind of exercise?
Yeah.
And what will get me even more plasticity? And so there are some basal things about heart rate and blood flow, et cetera. But anything that involves balance or coordination, it's incredible how fast the brain can learn. So things like dance, martial arts, a real sport, not just exercising. And I'm not, no disrespect to I'm more of just an exerciser than a sport guy. But if you're 40, 50, 60, 80, whatever, learning a new physical skill, we know is tremendously powerful for opening up neuroplasticity broadly. So some people will even leverage this where after they finish some physical skill learning or something, they might take a 20-minute nap and then they might read or they might try something. So when we see these people
I've been learning surfing. I'm like 60 years old.
Well, perfect. The vestibular.
And I'm like,
exactly.
I started learning tennis when I was 45, and it's really a challenge because it's not automatic and I have to really focus and be present.
Well, these individual cases are not necessarily the place to hang our hat completely. But for instance, the great physicist Richard Feynman, he was well known for learning bongo drums in the 60s, but in his 60s, then he became a quite accomplished painter later in life. And his whole thing was approach all of these things from a standpoint of play with intense focus.
Yeah.
And I think the play element is key because the play element keeps the agitation in check. So that when you're stepping on your partner's feet, trying to learn how to dance, or you're failing miserably, frustration is a real thing. And so I think that the element of playfulness, some people call it beginner's mind, but I think that should be the anchor point to return to. And people that maintain curiosity, or I should say that cultivate curiosity, and that cultivate a sense of play and willingness to take on new vestibular experiences of all things, they show remarkable plasticity into their late life. And I think that it all comes back to this thing that the brain won't change unless something changes in the weather of the brain. The overall milieu has to say, oh wait, everything that's about to happen is different.
Yeah.
Otherwise, why would it change? There are other goals that are very different. Last time we talked, you were learning Spanish.
Yeah,
right?
Still learning.
Yeah, great.
Still learning.
And there's a little bit more friction there because
very challenging.
It takes more effort to lean in because when you don't already know how to do something, it's a very different goal pursuit, right? Sort of like
so if I already have my business and I've been running it for a few years, certain practices of how to get to where you've been.
That's right.
And you're thinking, how do I double my business?
That's right.
It's different than I'm trying to learn a whole new skill goal.
Right. You already know how to forage for water, as opposed to you're some young calf or some animal that needs to learn how to walk
to survive.
Go live. Right. So I think one big goal of the sort that we don't actually have the skill set yet, or we're not even aware of what we need in order to accomplish it per year seems like a pretty good goal to me. So learning an entirely new language or an entirely new physical skill. But with any long-term goal, the problem is,
don't focus on the destination.
That's right. Well, so you have to move the horizon in, but you have to remember there's that one little pitfall, that cul-de-sac that I described, where you'll tell people, this year I'm going to do blank, and if they reward you enough, you might not do it. Remember, if you get enough dopamine...
That's amazing. I'm so happy you're doing that. Congratulations.
Right. And you say, I know I can do it, and then you sort of lose the incentive to do it. So a lot's been made out of making goals public.
Is it better to make them public or not?
Well, so this is a question. I don't know. I think that in my case it has. For me, telling several people that I'm going to do something, because I will work very hard to avoid
humiliation,
shame and disappointment.
Yeah.
But I tend to do that with things I really want to do anyway, but there's a strong fear element. Like I'm afraid to do this, or I'm kind of anxious about doing this. So I'll tell people, and then I'm like, okay, now I'm committed.
Yeah.
I got to do this.
You got to do it now.
And I tell people that I'm certain are going to give me a hard time.
Yeah.
That's just my nature.
Right.
And I'm not trying to prove them wrong. I'm just trying to make sure that they don't have any ground to stand on.
Yeah.
And that's how I do it. I think for some people, the continuation of what they're already doing, if it's feeling like a lot of work, it's feeling exceedingly challenging, and they're like, oh my God, another year of this, another 5 years of that. I think that's when you have to move the horizon in really close. I think a lot of people right now are feeling back on their heels because 2020 was such a trying year for a lot of people. So many people are recalibrating what's possible. Although many people are feeling expansion and they're really going to go forward full steam. So I think continuing in pursuits that we already have some degree of mastery over and thinking about where could I notch that up another 2 or 3%, I think that's incredibly valuable. I think that provides a lot of value to the individual, to their families, and to society, really. Because a 2% improvement of like what you're already doing is going to have an outsized effect on what other people receive, right? Even though for you, you've been down that road many times. But taking on a new pursuit in parallel to that means really getting excited about the possibility. You give the Jim Carrey example, about the possibility and starting to imagine what that would actually be like to be, well, let's say fluent in Spanish, and you can just do this reflexively without having to try. That's totally within your reach. And I think there it makes sense to really think about the end point quite a lot as a way to get over those barriers of fear. Because when you already know how to do something, there's no fear barrier. It's just an energy barrier.
Right.
But when you don't know how to do something, there's all this sense of clunkiness that is really uncomfortable. Beginner's mind is a painful place.
So hard, man.
A lot of people think about it like beginner's mind is such a delightful place to be.
So hard. The friction, the amount of energy to build momentum is so challenging in the beginning.
Well, this is where play becomes very important.
You need play.
The great physicist, Richard Feynman was also famous, in addition to being a physics phenom, for having this sense of play. He learned to bongo drum late in life. He became an artist late in life. And he had this lightness and this kind of joyful way to approach things. Humor at oneself is incredibly powerful. Now we know the chemical basis for that. Laughing at oneself is often the best way to move forward.
Really?
Yeah, because I do this, well, maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm biased, but I do this all the time. I'll just laugh at myself for how worked up I can get about the fact that a file won't load or something like that. And I just laugh. It's crazy. And all of a sudden I have the energy to do it.
So what does that do for our brain when we laugh at ourselves? But there's probably a difference between laughing at ourselves or something like that versus making fun of something that's a bad habit, like
not shaming ourselves.
Not shaming ourselves.
Yeah,
like,
because
I'm 200 pounds overweight. Let me laugh at myself.
Because shame is kind of written into like who we are. It's not about what we're doing. It has this element of like who we are. Guilt is sort of more about, I forget who said this, but it wasn't me first. I just want to be clear. I recognize it wasn't me first. Guilt is sort of more about what we did. Shame is like an identity thing.
But laughing at ourselves.
Yeah, like laughing at ourselves, like how ridiculous the human mind can
Gotcha.
be. Let's face it, as brilliant as the nervous system and our minds and our bodies can be, they make a lot of mistakes.
Yes.
We are a fallible species. We're not a perfect species, and perfection should never be the goal. And if I finish a chapter, I will stop for a moment and I'll just kind of smile and laugh at myself. I'm big on like self-reflection with humor and just think this is crazy. My brain is under my control. There would be people out there that say there's no free will, but I do not believe that. I put my hands in a lot of brains. You stimulate certain brain areas, people do things. You stimulate other brain areas, people think things. Ultimately, unless you have electrodes in your head and someone's stimulating them, we are in control of our thoughts and behaviors. Wow. We can't control all of them, but my goal is to be as deliberate and non-reflexive as possible in life. That's my goal from when I wake up in the morning until I go to sleep.
How do we get to that place?
Little by little and by rewarding each thing. If you get up and I'll use the make the bed example, make the bed, you're not back on your heels, you make a cup of coffee, you sit down, you script out something in a journal, you exercise, maybe you call a relative that you think might need to hear from you or that you'd like to talk to. You do something in a deliberate way, just being deliberate and learning to push away the things that are trying to make you reflexive is so important.
The nervous system is designed to orchestrate all the processes in the body, not just thinking and not just behavior, and really can be divided into 5 things. So there's sensation, And sensation is really bound or restricted by the receptors in the body. So receptors in the eye that perceive photons, light energy, receptors in the skin that perceive pressure, touch receptors, smell, taste, hearing, etc. And the interesting thing about sensation and the fact that the nervous system needs to pay attention to sensation is it's non-negotiable. The nervous system of humans is designed to extract physical phenomenon from the universe that are non-negotiable, photons of light. I can't see in the infrared with my eyes, and I can't see ultraviolet light with my eyes, and I can't perceive that because I don't have the receptors for it. So, other animals can perceive some of those things, but that leads us to the next thing, which is perception, which is which sensations are you paying attention to? So all the time you're sensing things. Like right now, your feet are sensing the contact with your shoes, but you're not thinking about it until I say that, and then you shift your perception. Right. So perception is like this spotlight. So the brain wants to constantly bring in sensation. It's non-negotiable what's coming in. It's just dependent on your environment. Perception is negotiable. You can control that because I just said shoes and you thought about your feet and there you are. Then there are feelings, which can be a little bit nebulous, but feelings are a link between our emotion and it generally invokes the body, sensations in the body and concepts in the mind of what those sensations are about. That's really what emotions are. Animals definitely experience them. I'm kind of appalled to think that 10 years ago, people were like, do animals have emotions? Of course they have emotions, right? Because those are bodily sensations merged with some perception. So of course they do. And then there's thoughts. And thoughts are interesting because thoughts happen spontaneously. Think about like a web browser that's constantly giving you pop-ups. But thoughts can also be deliberate. So you and I can decide right now that we're going to think about a plan for something, or we're going to think about what's going on in the world. So thoughts happen spontaneously and they can be deliberate. And then the final thing is behaviors and actions. So the nervous system is responsible for sensation, perception, feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. And what's interesting, you start to think about that as you're like, okay, that's a lot, but what is the nervous system really trying to accomplish? Like on any given day or at any moment, what's it trying to accomplish? And it's really trying to accomplish one thing, which is to take perceptions of the outside world and merge those with perceptions of the inside world, what we call interoception, and to link those in a way that's operating on our environment in the appropriate way. So what do I mean by that? So if I'm feeling anxious and I'm in a very calm environment, I'm going to perceive that rapid heart rate and kind of feeling of agitation in my body as inappropriate for the moment, right? And my goal then as an organism is to adjust my level of what they call autonomic arousal or alertness down. If I'm at a great party or I'm at a wedding or it's a celebration or I'm at a protest or, then I might feel that my level of alertness is appropriate for my environment. So the nervous system is in this constant dynamic interaction with the outside world and trying to figure that out. One way that this can be kind of conceptualized is there's an emerging idea that's kind of interesting about impatience. So we've all had the feeling of being impatient. Some people are far more patient than others. But if you've ever been in line at the store and you feel like something's going very slowly, the person in front of you is taking a long time, they're doing some returns and you're getting kind of impatient, maybe you're breathing in a mask and you're like, what's the idea is that if you're getting a certain frequency of pulses from your body, and if those pulses are coming in quickly, like you're perceiving yourself, that interoception quickly, it's like pulse, 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 pulse. You're going to be more geared towards your internal representation. And then you're seeing what's going on in the outside world and it seems like it's going very slowly. But there are other times when you're in line at the store, someone's getting some returns and you're texting on your phone, or you've had a great day, you've had a great run, your family's in great shape, and you're fine. Why? Well, the frequency of those pulses, that interoception, is matched pretty well to your outside environment. And so impatience is really when your internal sort of metronome, tick, 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 is not matched well to the external environment. There are other times when you're feeling like your internal metronome is tick, 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 and you've got a million things coming at you through email or text, and you've got a bunch of things, and you're feeling overwhelmed and tired. Well, in either case, there's nothing right or wrong. It's just your body and your brain are trying to say, what's going on in the outside world and how well matched am I to it?
Right.
So if you think about some of the sort of core practices of mindfulness and self-regulation, of like focusing on breathing or focusing on state of mind, a lot of that is trying to bring more awareness to your internal state. But what our brain is normally doing when our eyes are open and we're interacting in the world is we're constantly trying to update our internal state to match external demands of the world. And this harkens back to a really early design of all nervous systems, which is how do you take an organism that needs certain things, food, water, mates, reproduction, shelter, how do you move that organism? How do you create a system that will do that in best relation to the environment? And so what Mother Nature has done is designed a series of systems. Let's just take agitation and stress for one. If an animal or a human is very thirsty, you feel kind of agitated, you might get up and get a drink of water. If you're very thirsty, it can put you into a state of panic. If you're extremely thirsty and water is a limited resource, you might even resort to violence to get it, or negotiation of some sort that you wouldn't if you were calmer. So that stress and agitation were designed to actually mobilize the body to take us in the direction of something that's adaptive. So you can start to see these kind of core elements of what the brain and nervous system do: sensation, perception, feeling, thought, and action. And this constant challenge of trying to match our internal state to the external real estate, the outside world. And you start to see that the sensations that we call stress or impatience or calm are really the result of those attempts that the nervous system is trying to perform.
They get very micro. They move the horizon in very close. And so if you can move the horizon to something you know you can complete and you reward that, you essentially are where you were before. You're just as strong, if not stronger, but you're heading in the direction you need to go. You're not depleting. You're not spending out anything. And it feels a little weird because none of us like to reward things that aren't external. But the ability to control these internal reward schedules is everything.
One thing that you've talked about that I think is along these lines, be interesting to see if they feel as related to you when you know so much about it. But for me, at a high level, these feel very related. You talked about somebody gets in a car accident, acetylcholine, if I'm not mistaken.
To what extent does our subjective narrative,
the story we tell ourselves,
actually mean something for the body? And to what extent does the body actually mean something for the subjective narrative? The reason I call it a brain-body contract early on is that the brain and the body are constantly in dialogue. So, the idea that when we're depressed, we tend to be in more defensive type postures. When we're feeling good, we tend to be in more like relaxed and extended postures. All true. But it does not mean that just by occupying the extended posture that I'm going to completely shift the mind.
Right.
That's a first step. Think about like two interlocking gears. It's one gear that turns the other, but then they need to kind of dance together before you can get the whole system going.
So how do you get it to dance together?
Exactly. So there is one way in which subjective thought and deliberate thought is very powerful over states of mind and body. To answer your question, can you think your way out of the ice bath being cold? So a couple things that are important. First of all, just to go a little deeper on what thoughts are. Thoughts happen spontaneously all the time. Mm-hmm. They're popping up like a poorly filtered internet connection. But thoughts can also be deliberately introduced. For instance, right now, I can say, okay, have a thought that just decide to write your name. And you can do that. I'm going to decide to write my name, and you can do it. So that's a deliberate thought, which says that you can introduce thoughts. So I think it's very hard to control negative thoughts directly by trying to suppress them. Generally, they tend to just want to continue to geyser up all the time. Uh-huh. But we can introduce a positive thought.
An ability to control your levels of stress in real time is extremely powerful. It turns out you can do this using physiology and neuroscience. Your breathing can directly impact your heart rate and your level of stress or calm. Here's how it works. When you inhale, your diaphragm moves down. This creates more space in your thoracic cavity, and your heart actually gets a little bit bigger. As a consequence, the rate of blood flow through that larger heart volume slows down. A signal is sent from a group of neurons on your heart called the sinoatrial node. That signal goes up to the brain, and your brain sends a signal to speed the heart up. In other words, inhaling speeds your heart rate up. The opposite is true as well. When you exhale, your diaphragm moves up. Your heart gets a little bit smaller because there's a little bit less space in your thoracic cavity. As a consequence, blood flows more quickly through that smaller volume. The sinoatrial node registers that and sends a signal to your brain, and the brain sends a signal to slow the heart down. So in other words, inhaling speeds your heart rate up. Exhaling slows your heart rate down. So if you want to speed up your heart rate and be more alert, inhale more or make those inhales more vigorous, more intense. If you want to calm down, you can do that quickly by making your exhales slightly longer than your inhales or making them more vigorous. This doesn't require any breath work. This is something that you can do in real time. And that's what's called respiratory sinus arrhythmia. That's the technical phrase. It's also the basis of what's called heart rate variability, or HRV. But all you need to remember is inhaling deeper and longer will speed your heart rate up. Exhaling longer and more intensely will slow your heart rate down and will allow you to calm down in real time.
You can learn so much, for better or for worse. I always say the downside is that early in life, you have less control over your life circumstances, but your brain is very plastic. So there's a dark and light to that. Later in life, you have a lot more control generally over your life circumstances, but the brain becomes less plastic. However, we know, based on Nobel Prize winning work and recent work in addition to that, that the neuromodulator acetylcholine is secreted when we pay attention to something very specific. It acts as sort of a spotlight in the brain, making certain synapses, the connections between neurons, more active and more likely to be active again than others. So when you hear that song that you love so much and it moves you and you feel dopamine being pulsed into your body, that's a real thing. You're actually getting dopamine secretion. You've formed that deep association with that. And acetylcholine draws your attention to that. And that song is essentially wired in a very indelible way into your nervous system at multiple. You can probably, even with certain songs, you can feel your body start to energize because, of course, the brain, through connections with your muscles, controls your body. So for things that are traumatic or negative, what we're really talking about is neuroplasticity that's focused on unlearning. And most of the therapies for this, whether or not it's EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, or it's traditional psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, or it's somatic embodied release, big, Kundalini breathing type, almost all of those are designed to do something, which is to bring the person, or you bring yourself, into a state of heightened alertness, right? You can't do this stuff when you're sort of half asleep. Heightened alertness, and then focusing your attention on the traumatic or negative event. This is the way that it works. And then pairing that with something new. Traditionally this was done with things like NLP or in talk therapy, where people would feel the positive relationship with the therapist. That was kind of the main rationale in association with this very traumatic, sometimes even, shameful type events. And the idea is that you would simultaneously have those two experiences, the negative one and the feeling of safety, and you would rewire those circuitries. I actually believe that can work, but it can take a lot of times. It can take a lot of visits to the therapist, which is not to say it's bad. It's just not everyone has access to those resources. Things like eye movement desensitization reprocessing, simply moving the eyes laterally while recounting these negative events. The woman who devised this figured out that somehow when people recount these traumatic experiences, when they're doing these lateralized eye movements, not vertical eye movements, they somehow separate out the negative emotions. And I thought for years, people would ask me about this stuff, Tom, and I thought, this is ridiculous. First of all, I'm a vision scientist and I work on stress. It's like, there's no way. And then I really ate my words, because 4 papers, 2 in humans, 2 in mice, and then a 5th paper published in Nature, which is kind of our Super Bowl of scientific publishing, showed that these lateralized eye movements quiet the amygdala. They actually suppress activation of this threat detection center in the amygdala. And
why would that be true?
So this is really where it gets cool. Turns out, because of when the way that we view the visual world when we move through space, when our head moves or when we walk and things flow past us, that these lateralized eye movements are what happens when you move forward in space, when you're walking, when you're moving forward towards something. And that suppresses activation of the amygdala. Now you say, why? Well, okay, so then 2018, my laboratory did an experiment. There was actually a graduate student in my laboratory where we're looking at fear. In this case, we were looking at fear to big looming objects that either trigger freezing or running and hiding. There's a brain area that's in your brain and my brain that mice also have that triggers a third option, not run and hide, not freeze, but forward confrontation. This is the, no, I'm going to fight. I'm going to move forward in the face of adversity. This is the growth mindset. I'm going to lean into friction. And it turns out that this circuit is linked to the dopamine reward pathway. When we move forward in the face of a threat, and obviously we want to do this in healthy, adaptive ways, we suppress activity of the amygdala through physical action of moving forward, and there's a signal sent to the areas of the brain that control dopamine reward. Those reward centers then trigger the release of dopamine to reward forward effort in the face of stress or threat. So when you hear about people saying, look, take some physical action when you're feeling exhausted, take some forward physical action when you're feeling overwhelmed by this traumatic experience. Now, that could be in the form of a walk. Now, this therapist, she figured out with EMDR, because you can't take people walking around for therapy sessions, she figured out that these lateralized eye movements are what triggers suppression of the amygdala. And it makes perfect sense because the amygdala, this threat detection center in our brain, it doesn't connect to the limbs. So how does it know if you're moving forward? Well, because the eyes are moving. You have these reflexive eye movements that move anytime you're moving through space. So to make this a little more succinct, it's really forward movement, action, pushing yourself across that threshold. Not only rewards you, but it suppresses activity of the fear centers in the brain. And these are ancient hardwired mechanisms. These aren't hacks. These are things that Mother Nature installed in us.
So I love this more than you could possibly imagine. This is so interesting.
So I'm a big fan of wellness, and I think it's a great community, but it tends to run in absolutes, and there aren't a lot of operational definitions, as we say in science. And what I love about your questions, you're asking for really getting to the meat of things, asking for the operational definitions. One of the most dangerous ideas in wellness and in popular psychology is that your body hears every thought you have. What a terrible thing to put on people. You know, what a challenging thing. I don't think people should try and suppress their negative thoughts. I think there is great value, however, to introducing positive thought schemes. Now, the reason is not because I think it's just because I think so, but because there's actually a neurochemical basis for controlling stress and actually making stress more tolerable and extending one's ability to be in bouts of effort. And that relates to the dopamine pathway. So the molecule dopamine is a reward. It's released in the brain when you win a game, you close a deal, you meet the love of your life, someone likes your photo, the great love of your life, you complete something. But most of our dopamine release is not from achieving goals. It's actually released when we are en route to our goals, when we're in pursuit of our goals, and we think we're on the right path. Is one meditation, very short, 5 minutes, where for one breath, you close your eyes and go internal, and you get behind, and some people call it the third eye, right? I'm gonna get the language wrong, but we all know what we're talking about. You get inside your breath. And then the second thing you do is you focus on something at a short distance. There's a powerful system in your brain when you focus both eyes on a single point, like a watchmaker making a watch, or you're reading. That state is accessing very specific channels in your brain that are very different from the one that when you close your eyes, okay? And it's called a vergence eye movement when you put both your eyes on the same thing. And then the last one is the one that we get a lot of here, that feeling, awesome feeling when you go out to the beach or you're on the top of a mountain or you look at the horizon or you arrive in New York City if you're me and you just go, oh my God, and you're defocused. And that's when these ideas, the creativity kind of spontaneously geysers up from below. But then you have to get back and you need to get to work on something. And so what's been very powerful, and we're putting patients through this, or subjects in brain imaging, is this way of accessing all these different brain states is really about accessing different notions of space and time, trying to get access to your whole brain. And it's a short meditation. I recommend just one breath at each of these kind of stations, in your mind, up close and focusing on your hand, and out. And I'll repeat that a few times during my morning, or maybe once or twice during the day. It's quick, and we're getting remarkable feedback from the people that are doing this about the kind of state that it puts them in, both engaged and present with the bigger picture. And in the end, it's all about the bigger picture, right? Because it's about not just what you do with your life, but how you're gonna create good in the world. So one of the reasons why breathing is such a powerful tool for shifting one's state is that, A, it's always available for voluntary control. It's just right there. I can decide right now to do 3 inhales, or I can just go back to breathing reflexively. I can just do that at any moment. So the neural real estate, which is in the brainstem that controls breathing, is in a unique position because it's at the kind of boundary between conscious control and unconscious control. I can't do that for my digestion. I can't do that for most everything that happens internally. The other thing is that breathing controls or level of alertness very dramatically. So the faster you breathe, generally, the more alert you are. The slower you breathe, the more calm you're going to be.
The faster you breathe, meaning shorter, quick breaths, or
either way. So, we're just to take a brief adventure through the neuroscience of breathing and how it relates to brain states. And there's some fun tools in here. So forgive me for this tangent, but you have two brain areas that are responsible for breathing. One is called, for the aficionados, the pre-Buttsinger complex. It was discovered by Jack Feldman at UCLA. It's named after a bottle of wine, so now people won't forget it. And it controls rhythmic breathing. So inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. It's just rhythmic breathing. There's another brain area that controls breathing, which is near what's called the parafacial nucleus, which involves breathing anytime there are double inhales or double exhales or triple inhales. And you say, well, why would you have this second brain area for breathing? Well, it turns out when you're speaking or crying or coughing, you need to coordinate your breathing with your speaking. And that means sometimes you need to take multiple inhales or multiple exhales. And this is all happening very, very fast. You don't notice. But there's a very important discovery that was made a few years ago by Jack's lab and by a guy named Mark Krasno at Stanford, who discovered there's a set of neurons in your brainstem, my brainstem, everybody's brainstem, and every mammal's brainstem. It's a very small number of neurons that controls a specific pattern of breathing, which are called physiological sighs. So these are not just sighs where you go and exhale. These are sighs that involve doing 2 inhales and then an extended exhale.
We all do this.
You do this during sleep. Anytime carbon dioxide levels in your bloodstream get too high, in order to get more oxygen into your system. People also do this if they've been crying or sobbing. They'll do this and then they'll exhale. So what's happening with these physiological sighs and why is this powerful? So your lungs are 2 big bags of air, but they actually are made up of a ton of little sacs of air called the alveoli of the lungs. When we are exercising or when we are sleeping or anytime we're doing anything, these little sacs of air eventually start to collapse. And what happens is carbon dioxide builds up in our system and we experience that as stress. We actually feel the impulse to breathe because carbon dioxide levels get too high. There are neurons that sense carbon dioxide. And then without realizing it, you do a double inhale and then exhale. Typically the inhales are done through the nose and the exhale is done through the mouth. So it looks like... And why the second inhale? Well, if you've ever tried to blow up a balloon for a kid at a kid's party or just blown up a balloon, you sometimes blow into that empty balloon. It doesn't go anywhere. So what do? You do 2 you go, and then it pops open. So these double inhales pop open the alveoli of the lungs. They don't explode them, but they pop them open, which pulls carbon dioxide out of the bloodstream, brings oxygen, and then you offload carbon dioxide. So if you watch a dog right before it takes a nap or something, it often will do these. Now what's cool about these physiological sighs is from work in our lab, and that's still ongoing, I just want to say it's still ongoing, but work in other labs as well, double inhales followed by an extended exhale are the fastest way that I'm aware of to bring the mind and the body into a more relaxed state.
Really?
Yeah.
The fastest way. So if I'm stressed, I'm overwhelmed, just do a 3 or 2?
2 inhales through the nose. And then exhale slow through the mouth. 1 to 3 of those repeated will bring your level of autonomic arousal down basically to baseline.
I would hide in the Tower Books section in the evenings, and I would read everything about fitness, psychology, anything I could. I've always devoured information. My favorite book when I was a kid was the Encyclopedia or the Guinness Book of World Records. So I would, like when I was a little kid, I'd walk around the Aspen Center for Physics and I would tell anyone. I didn't even ask them if they wanted to hear about like what's the world's smallest eutherian mammal. You know, I would like it could tell you all these facts that were kind of meaningless at the time, but I've always been fascinated by the inventory of different animals on the planet and their different behaviors. And so, yeah, voracious reader, and still now. Yeah, I love information.
You know, that beliefs are attached to a set of rewards.
Interesting.
So now the dopamine system is exceedingly powerful because dopamine is a kind of a dumb molecule. It has no brain of its own. It's just a molecule, right? It's just a chemical. But when dopamine is released in our brain, first of all, it tends to orient us towards goals in the outside environment. It's the molecule not just of reward, but of motivation. And when we release dopamine, we tend to see the world in terms of external goals. And so you can imagine now if there's a process built up inside us where our thoughts are causing dopamine release, and dopamine is shaping what we see as rewards, what we perceive as rewards. That can be wonderful or terrible, depending on how that's harnessed.
So let me understand this. When we have dopamine triggered in our body, because it's attached to some type of belief, we're going to continue to say, this feels good.
That's right.
So let me keep thinking this way.
And viewing the world this way.
In this way, because it's going to keep making me feel good.
That's right.
Physically.
That's right.
Wow. Even if it's fact or not fact, scientifically true or not true.
Or harmful to other people or harmful to yourself.
If it makes you feel good, you might stick to that belief.
That's right. So a good example with dopamine is, with anytime thinking about science and neuroscience in particular, thinking at the extremes can be kind of useful. So people who are very depressed, who see no possibility in the world, who, if you talk to a depressed person, every response they give is going to be, but it's not going to work out.
It doesn't work for me.
They are absolutely certain that things are going to turn out bad.
And there's a benefit for having that belief,
and
right?
they're entrenched in it. They may actually be rewarding that somewhat, although typically depressed states have very low dopamine. At the opposite extreme is mania. When people are in a manic phase, dopamine is very high, we know this, and they see possibility everywhere, and there's certain things are going to work out. They will spend money they don't have, they'll create relationships they don't have time and energy for, they will overdo everything. And so somewhere in the middle is this healthy range where where we realize that how we view the world is shaping the release of these chemicals. And I do believe this happens when we have positive thoughts. We get a lift. If we can get a lift from our positive thoughts, and then dopamine itself puts us in relationship with the outside world such that we view the outside world as having more possibility, that is going to put us into forward momentum. There are a lot of studies to support that. When dopamine is low, we tend to see very little possibility in the world. So
a positive thought triggers forward movement, potentially.
Yes. Yeah.
So positive thinking, which a lot of people will say, well, that's just positive thinking, it doesn't work. Some people say, well, be positive, think positive. Others say, well, it doesn't work. But with science, I'm hearing you say it gives you a little bit of a lift.
Absolutely. The key with positive thinking is that it has to be honest. It can't be, I've already won, I don't have an Olympic gold medal. If I could tell myself I'm going to get one tomorrow, but I just don't have the skills. So that's not going to release dopamine in my system.
How do you know it's honest if you're in a depressed state and you don't believe that you are actually better off than where you're at?
The key is to attach so one thing to understand is that dopamine release in the brain is always subjective. There's no experience that says, that has unique domain over dopamine release, that will only allow dopamine release. So if it's very subjective. So if I say to myself, I'm going to get into the process of doing something. We have a new year coming up, so there's going to be a lot of resolutions soon. It's not if you attach the dopamine release to the process of effort or goal setting itself, you'll have more energy to be in effort. And then if you can attach dopamine release to the belief that you're at least heading in the right direction, you'll have more energy to keep going in the right direction. People make the mistake of thinking that the positive thought process should be attached to the finish line. It's not about thinking you've already won. It's not about being delusional. It's about thinking that your training is going to take you to the finish line. And so it's about moving that mental horizon in more closely, and then triggering some sort of positive internal representation of what you're doing, meaning thinking positive. And people, this is usually where I get stopped and people say, wait, but it sounds so subjective. Tell me exactly how to do it. But here's the key point. It's supposed to be subjective. This
for you, right?
For everyone needs to figure out what allows them to continue to be in forward momentum, what allows them to constrain the world of possibilities and to go after goals, and how often to self-reward. But the key is the self-word, because if you start only pursuing external rewards, that's when you are no longer in control of your dopamine system.
Because you're reliant on actually something physically happening in the physical world, not internal.
That's right. And let's be really, really honest and burst the bubble that I feel like should have been burst a long time ago, which is, yes, everybody, including me, it is possible that you can do everything and still fail. No one wants to say that.
But the way that you ensure against that is to attach reward to the effort process, because the dopamine molecule creates a sense of certainty, and you're not trying to create certainty about the final outcome. You're trying to create certainty only about the next outcome that's en route to the final outcome.
The next action outcome.
So you want to think about milestones.
Yes.
And so people set out with, I'm gonna write the great American novel, or I'm going to get the IPO. And of course, that's an important, you need to have a sense of what the finish line would actually look like. But the more that one can attach this subjective release of dopamine process to the intermediate steps through positive thinking and action, the higher that probability goes toward, in science we say there's a probability of 0 to 1. The higher that probability goes to 1, which is certainty. Now, everyone knows in the back of their mind that there is no absolute certainty. When I hear about, athletes or fighters, I was certain I was going to win. We all know that there's a 0.00000 doubt in everybody.
Right.
0.00, whatever that is. Now, for some people, they might be able to push that number way, way out. But certainty about outcome is actually a form of delusion. Certainty
it's
about
like a mania, yeah.
That's right. That's right. You see this in mania, and that's why people start engaging in behaviors that aren't good.
Fixated on this is going to happen.
That's right. The silver lining in this is that when you create certainty about outcomes you can control, you take over this neurobiological system, and you create almost certainty that you will complete the process to the end goal perfectly. Understanding that pain and pleasure are in this really dynamic balance can also help us, which in the following way. Any pain that you feel, the longer day, the less sleep, the kind of agony that things aren't working, that power outlet doesn't work, or the internet is slow, whatever it is, the amount of pleasure that you will eventually experience is directly related to how much pain you experience. So we know this from actually what nowadays would be considered quite barbaric and unethical experiments, where they would give people electrical shocks and they would measure their response. And then they'd say, we're going to increase it. Eventually they get to the point where a shock that was previously very painful actually evokes a sense of pleasure. Now, you couldn't do these experiments anymore. These are not the experiments I do in my lab. These are older experiments. But for instance, and this has been discussed in scientific research papers, giving somebody a 10-minute ice bath, for instance, or even a 3-minute ice bath, or a 1-minute ice bath is quite painful. But there was a study from the University of Prague, European Journal of Physiology, showed that after a painful ice bath stimulus, the amount of dopamine release goes up for 2.5 hours to 250% above baseline. And that's not because the ice bath itself evokes dopamine release. A lot of people think, cold water evokes dopamine release. No, pain evokes dopamine release after the pain is over. Yesterday, I tweaked my back because I do this stupid thing every few years, the same stupid thing, and it's really painful. And then you just remember all the ways in which you can't move around. I was standing up this morning, I'm and just walking is so painful. As the pain has started to dissipate, you get a little bit of a high, right? You get a little bit of a euphoria. That's dopamine, because of the degree of pain that you experienced previously predicts how much pleasure. So when you start a company down in the dregs and you're shoveling again, that's beautiful, because that means that the win that you achieve is going to be as good or greater than the one you had previously, in your case with Quest. And so we go back to this example of the person that's not motivated, that can't get off the couch, that doesn't want to do anything. Well, this is the problem. Remember the rat experiment? They are effectively the rat with no dopamine, but they can still achieve some sense of pleasure by consuming excess calories, by consuming social media. And look, I'm not judging, I do this stuff too, right? Scrolling social media. If you've ever scrolled social media and you're like, I don't even know why I'm doing this. It doesn't really feel that good. And I can remember a time where you'd see something that was just so cool, or you'd see something online. I remember this when TED Talks first came out. I was like, this is amazing. These are some, at least some of them are really smart people sharing really cool insights. And then now that there are like a gazillion TED Talks, I remember spending a winter in my office when I was a junior professor, cleaning my office finally, and binging TED Talks in the background, thinking this is a good use of my time. Pretty soon, they all sucked to me. I was like, this isn't good. So what you need to do is stop watching TED Talks for a while, wait, and then they become interesting again. And that's this pain-pleasure balance. And so for people that aren't feeling motivated, the problem is they're not motivated, but they're getting just enough or excess sustenance. So they're getting the little mild hits of opioid. It becomes an opioid system. And if you think about the opioid drugs as opposed to dopaminergic drugs make people rabid for everything. You know, drugs of abuse like cocaine and amphetamine make people incredibly outward directed, right? They hardly notice anything except what they want more of, more. It's bad because those drugs trigger so much dopamine release that they become the reward. It's very circular. Only the drug can give that much dopamine. Nothing they could pursue would give them as much dopamine as the drug itself. So there's that. And then there's the kind of opioid-like effects of constantly indulging oneself with social media or with video games or with food or with anything to the point where it no longer evokes the motivation and craving. And this is really the new evolution of the understanding of dopamine in neuroscience, which is that dopamine itself is not the reward. It's the buildup to the reward. And the reward has more of a kind of opioid bliss-like property, which itself is not bad if it's endogenous, released from within. But when we can just sit there like the rat with no dopamine, gorging ourselves with pleasures, so to speak, what you end up with is somebody that feels really unmotivated, and those pleasures no longer work to tickle those feel-good circuits. And so there's no reason for them to go out and pursue anything. And that's a pretty dark picture. So the keys are to pursue rewards, but understand that the pursuit is actually the reward if you want to have repeated wins, okay? The celebration has to be less than the pursuit. And that's hard for some people to do. It's got to be that your celebration is slightly less dopaminergic. It can be very reflective. You can be in gratitude. Those are other neurotransmitter systems, but you don't want to be on that high as you celebrate the win. You want to be trickling out your dopamine regularly until you pursue things.
Previously, I told you that it's great to foreshadow failure, that's a great way to get your system into a state of activation. I also told you that you want to set goals that are challenging but possible. And again, here I'm paraphrasing from the work of Emily Balcetis. I want to be very clear. There are a few other things that one can do in order to bias the likelihood that you will succeed in trying to achieve your goals. First of all, limit your options. Trying to pursue too many goals at once can definitely be counterproductive. Now, I realize that life is complicated. We all have multiple goals that we're trying to pursue. But if we have particular goals that are important to us, we have to be careful to not get distracted by other goals. And many people run into this problem. So setting 1 or 2 or maybe 3 major goals for a given year is going to be more than enough for most people and is actually going to be challenging for most people. Now, of course, we have daily goals and monthly goals and yearly goals. But if we have big, lofty goals, we need to be careful not to contaminate our mental space and our visual space with too many goals. And why do I say visual goals? Well, what various department stores and supermarkets have discovered is that the greater the number of things in our visual attention, the more that we can draw our attention and our goals off a line of pursuit. What does that mean? Well, let's think about it in the practical context. This has actually been done. Big department stores have figured out that if they stock their shelves chock-a-block with many, many options of food or clothing items or objects or anything like that, people simply buy more stuff. People are very prone to orienting their attention to whatever's in front of them. You put a lot of stuff in front of them, their attention drifts. You put fewer things in front of them, their attention is more narrow. In a later episode, we'll talk about designing a workspace that's optimized on the basis of this. It doesn't mean being in a room with nothing except just your desk and a computer. It doesn't have to be that sparse. But visual sparseness actually can help us orient our focus and our behavior. When we have a lot of things in our visual environment or a lot of things in our cognitive environment, it's the same thing. And so if you're going to try and pursue a fitness goal, a relationship goal, an academic goal, and a long-term life financial goal all at once, that's 4 things. And you're going to have to come up with systems that allow you to isolate those goals in a very rigid way.
If you want to learn and change your brain as an adult, there has to be a high level of focus and engagement. There's absolutely no way around this because so focus and intensity and that kind of the Goggins phenotype, right? I think Goggins is now a noun, a verb, and a pronoun, right? It's amazing. So if you're going to Goggins this process, what you need to do is you need to, regardless of how agitated you feel, you have to lean in and focus extremely hard.
Now, the reason for that is that there's a neurochemical, norepinephrine, also called adrenaline, same thing, that's released in the brain and body. Most people back off at that point because they feel this agitation. But we have to remember that that noradrenaline was designed to get us into movement. That's the purpose of noradrenaline, to take us out of stillness and into movement. And then the other thing we have to do is we have to take that elevated level of alertness and we have to focus it. And there's a second neuromodulator called acetylcholine, which is secreted from this little structure in the base of the forebrain when we visually focus on something. Or in the case of maybe if you're doing auditory learning, when you focus with your auditory attention. So there is something called adrenal insufficiency syndrome, which is a real medical phenomenon where the adrenals are incapable of making these cortisol and adrenal hormones. But the truth is that you have enough adrenaline and cortisol in your body to last 2 lifetimes and 25 famines. I mean, we were built with a lot of robustness, right? This explains, the David Goggins of the world. We all do have that greater capacity that people talk about. The stress is very misunderstood because people think of stress as this ancient carryover that's very unfortunate. It kind of gets lumped with depression, like, oh, this is just a flaw in our design or something. But actually, stress is wonderful. It actually activates our immune system. So anytime you liberate adrenaline into your bloodstream, you also protect yourself against infection of bacteria and viruses. Because if you think about it, if we had to gather food and we didn't have it, and we had to then pack up and migrate long distances, you can't afford to get sick. And this is why people who work, and then rest, they usually get sick when they finally stop and rest. Really? Yeah, it's like the post-finals phenomenon in university or after the season for a game, or the caretaker's thing where you're taking care of somebody who's ill and you're just work, or taking care of young children, and then you finally stop to rest, you go on vacation, and you get slammed with an illness.
Why is that? Because you're being in your comfort zone now? Or
because stress turned off. And adrenaline, so that the stress response recruits the immune organs of the body to release killer T cells. In fact, Wim Hof breathing, I know you're familiar with Wim, of doing 20 or 30 deep inhales and exhales, and also combined with some breath hold type work, exhale, hold, inhale, hold, is known to stimulate adrenaline release. And one of the better papers that's out there, scientific peer-reviewed papers, is a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences where they brought in 2 groups. One group did Wim Hof breathing. The other group did just mindful meditation. Both groups were injected with E. coli.
This is crazy.
Right?
It's crazy.
Right? It's crazy. The meditators got fever, diarrhea, and vomiting. And the people who did Wim Hof either didn't get it or got it to a much lesser extent.
Felt sluggish, but
That's
not.
right. They didn't. Right.
Isn't that
this
crazy?
is not an experiment to do at home.
Isn't this crazy?
But it makes perfect sense because that breathing simulates a stress response. It stimulates cortisol and adrenaline, which
protects the body.
Right. Which signals to the thymus, the spleen, and the other, the nodes of the immune system to liberate killer cells. And so when that bacteria comes in, the system is ready for it.
Your body is defending against viruses and disease, essentially. When you create a routine of healthy stress.
That's right. And we could talk about, we definitely you don't want stress on all the time. Sleep is really important, et cetera. But that stress response combats infection because it recruits immune cells. So everything that happens to you, your entire experience, I don't care what anyone says, I don't care what alignment the earth is in, everything is happening because your brain has these 3 jobs. And all of your experience is filtered through that thing in your head, that pile of cells that's arranged in a very specific way that we're still trying to understand, called your brain. Just like we could be talking about the heart, whose job is to pump blood. So I want to describe just how the brain works in 3 basic ways, 2 of which you've heard about before. We all have heard the lizard brain, the thing that freaks you out when you think there's someone standing in the corner and then you turn on the light and there's nobody, or if you were to come up on a car wreck and all of a sudden your heart's pumping. Your brain is very good at that stuff, and that's great. That's why you're alive at this moment. It is an unerring, unfailing system keeping you alive, your lizard brain, and it's generally designed to keep you alive and to scare you from doing things that would hurt you. And it's a shame, because I would have liked it to be generally good at making me feel good all the time. But that's generally not what it's good at. And I'm stealing from the great Tony Robbins, who says, there's paved roads to fear and misery and cobblestone or dirt roads to happiness. And that's true at the level of neuroanatomy. You don't have a whole lot of your brain devoted to happiness. You got a lot of your brain designed to keep you safe. So anxieties and fears come about a lot easier, and you need to combat those. We're all getting better at that. Thinking, planning, imagining, and doing is the other kind of end of the spectrum. I talked about that. And then there's the one that really counts, right? Which is this thing in the middle, which is the way that those things are connected. What do you think depends on how you feel. What you feel depends on how you think. We know this now. There's kind of common knowledge. And it's these maps of your experience. It depends on what happened to you and how you view the world. And we know this at a psychological level. Neuroscientists sometimes talk like this. They often don't. I'm in the minority. But there's a lot of neuroanatomy, there's a lot of powerful neuroscience to support this. What do I mean by your maps of experience? I mean what happened to you shapes how you view the world. And so what's important is how you change how you view the world if you want to go forward beyond what would just how you were programmed, let's say.
It was me realizing I'm living in this squat. I've got a pet ferret. My girlfriend's gone. She broke up with me. She was smart enough to break up with me, I'm getting in fights. I'm working at a bagel shop. I'm barely making ends meet. And at that point, I just made the decision. I just said, okay, look, I'm not going to be a professional athlete. I think I'm pretty good at memorizing things. I think I have an interest in people. I'm going to just decide. I just decided to do school. I decided that was the track. So like some people pick the military because it's like if you know what to expect, at least in terms of the passages that you're going to go through. And for me, that was school. And so I decided to get back in school. I moved into a studio apartment by myself. I quit partying completely. I didn't go to parties. I got really serious about fitness. So I just started running and lifting weights. And I studied.
You went like Henry Rollins style.
I did.
Yeah.
I did.
That's a lot of self-awareness, I mean, people go into the military because on some level, I mean, some people do because there's some yearning for having that structure imposed upon their lives. But you constructed that kind of structure for yourself.
Yeah, I think I was really afraid. I think I was like, and these days, because my lab studies fear and I get into this whole thing around mindsets, people always ask me like, is it better to do something from a place of love or fear? Like, it depends. And at that point, fear was the best motivator for me. And I just basically worked like crazy.
Because you made it this far in a video, I want to celebrate you. Most people start and don't finish. Most people never actually follow through. Most people say they want something, but they don't ever do the work to actually get it. But you are different. You are special. Believe Nation, you made it here all the way to the end, and I love you. So as a special celebration, if you put a hashtag believe down in the comments below on this video, I will showcase you and celebrate you somewhere on the screen in a future video because you are awesome. To learn the 10 neuroscience hacks that can make you unstoppable, check the video right there next to me. I think you'll love it. Continue to believe, and I'll see you there.
We have the ability to actually change the story all the time.
If you can move the horizon to something you know you can complete and you reward that, you essentially are where you were before